Welcome, my friend, and thank you for choosing to spend a quiet moment of your night here with me in this small corner of time we share together. Before we begin, I invite you to settle in, perhaps dim the lights, soften your breathing, and let the noise of the day fall gently behind you. Tonight, we're about to travel far across centuries, through candlelit halls, forgotten battlefields, bustling markets, silent monasteries, and the shifting borders of old empires. And we will do it slowly, calmly, as if walking through history with a lantern in hand, letting each step reveal just enough to guide the next. In this video, you will hear the full, winding journey of the Ottoman Empire, its rise, its glory, and the 20 quiet, deadly mistakes that slowly threaded themselves through its institutions and finally shaped its destiny. But we won't rush, we won't shout, we won't dramatize the fall of an empire that took 600 years to build. Instead, we will drift gently through its story, like walking along the Bosphorus at dusk, listening to the water murmur against the stones, while the city lights flicker awake, one by one. You'll hear about the princes raised in gilded cages, the janissaries who turned from guardians into obstacles, the scholars who held tight to ancient knowledge while the world outside raced into new science, the diplomats balancing rival powers as Europe drew invisible lines across their maps, and the ordinary villagers, quiet, anonymous souls, whose fields, taxes and sons sustained an empire that rarely understood how deeply it leaned upon them. And among these 20 mistakes, you'll notice something. None of them roar, they whisper, they accumulate slowly. They arrive as small hesitations, half decisions, delays, and overlooked details, until one day the weight becomes too much for the pillars of the old world to bear. My aim tonight is not to judge the past, but to guide you through it in a way that helps you breathe more deeply, see more clearly, and fall gently into the comforting rhythm of a story told with care. Before we start, let me ask you something, just softly, almost as a personal note. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I'm always curious how our paths cross. Whether you're in a quiet room in Vietnam, a dim apartment in Europe, a warm bed in the US, or somewhere else entirely. Whether it's late midnight, early dawn, or that calm pocket of evening when the world slows just enough for you to hear your own heartbeat again. If you'd like, you can let me know in the comments. It's always a beautiful thing to see people from different countries gathering together in the same moment, listening to the same old stories, woven into a single peaceful thread. And before we move into part one, let me gently remind you, if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, if you appreciate long, quiet journeys into the rise and fall of civilizations, into forgotten myths and ancient empires, then I invite you to support the entire history by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this small lantern shine a little brighter, and it ensures you won't miss the next chapter when it arrives softly at your doorstep. Tonight, prepare for a slow unfolding. 20 parts, each one a different window into the Ottoman world. 20 reflections on how an empire lives, breathes, struggles, adapts, and eventually lets go. So take a breath, let your shoulders loosen, and when you're ready, we'll step together into the long corridors of Topkapi Palace, where the echoes of old decisions are still faintly alive, waiting for our footsteps to pass through. Welcome to the entire history. Let's begin. Tonight you're listening to part 1 of our journey into the 20 deadly mistakes of the Ottoman Empire. In this part, we'll linger with a single, quiet but devastating question. Who should rule next, and how a lack of clear succession tore slowly at the heart of the empire? In the soft darkness of the palace at Istanbul, Long after the lamps have been dimmed, one can imagine the corridors of Top Capo almost breathing, stone walls holding the echoes of whispered oaths, hurried footsteps, and the faint rustle of silk as servants slip past one another like shadows. At the very centre of this world stands the figure of the Sultan, the Padishah of the horizons, and around him stood, unseen but ever present, the question that would haunt the empire from its earliest centuries. When this man's breath finally stills, who will stand in his place? The Ottomans rose from the edge of Anatolia as warriors of faith and conquest, driven by a deep desire to survive and to expand, to push their banners across the Balkans and the Middle East, to be more than just another small beylik swallowed by history. Their greatest khans and sultans longed not only for victory, but for continuity, a line that would stretch from father to son, unbroken, carrying their name forward like a river running through time. Yet in the most intimate chamber of power, the moment of succession, there was no single written law, no quiet, precise rule that all could agree upon. There was only custom, fear, and ambition. Princes in the Ottoman world grew up in a strange blend of privilege and dread. As young boys, they were sent to govern provinces, given tutors, soldiers, and advisors, groomed to be both administrators and warriors. They watched their fathers from afar, trying to read moods and intentions, quietly asking themselves, am I the chosen one? Am I meant to inherit this world of domes and banners and distant frontiers? That yearning, the desire to be the one, to justify their blood, to complete what their ancestors had begun, was powerful and very human. But it lived side by side with something darker, the knowledge that brothers were not simply rivals in pride, but potential threats to survival. In an empire without a fixed rule, like primogeniture, every prince could imagine himself as sultan. And when everyone can rule, everyone can also be killed. Inside each prince, there formed a tangle of emotions that few outside the dynasty could fully grasp. They were taught loyalty to the dynasty, yet loyalty to the dynasty might one day demand the death of a brother. They were educated in Islamic law and justice, yet the unwritten law of survival insisted that mercy could be fatal. Some sultans came to believe that for the order of the world, fratricide was not only permissible but necessary, that it was better for a few to die than for the empire to dissolve into war. Later, confinement in the cafes, the gilded cage within the palace, replaced open fratricide. Princes lived in safety, but also in stifling isolation, growing older without experience, their minds slowly softening in the shadows. Between these two extremes, the sword and the cage, lay an internal crisis for the dynasty itself. How could a ruler be both just and ruthless enough to preserve the state? How could he be a shepherd to his people when he knew that his first and most brutal decisions had been taken against his own blood? Outside the palace walls, other forces watched these dilemmas with cold attention. European courts listened for news that a mighty sultan had died and that his heirs were at odds. Envoys reported on which prince had the favour of which pasha, which janissary aga whispered in which ear. The enemies of the empire, Habsburg commanders on the frontiers, Venetian admirals, later Russian tsars, all understood that a moment of succession was a moment of weakness. Armies could be pushed harder, treaties could be negotiated with sharper demands, rebels in distant provinces could be quietly encouraged. Inside the empire too, the janissary corps and powerful viziers sensed the same thing. The uncertainty of succession was their opportunity to extract promises, wealth, and influence. When the next sultan was not clearly designated, factions formed like storm clouds. Each group wagering on its own candidate, each prepared to move in the confusion. And so with every unclear succession, the empire invited its enemies, foreign and domestic, to test its armour. There were always those who tried to steer this dangerous process towards something calmer, more orderly. Wise viziers and scholars urged sultans to clarify the rules, to put into writing who should inherit and under what conditions. Some proposed a strict seniority system where the oldest male in the dynasty would automatically succeed. Others looked longingly toward Europe's clearer rules of primogeniture, imagining a world where the throne passed without bloodshed, like a candle flame handed from one taper to the next. These figures, advisors, tutors, judges, were the quiet allies of stability. They dreamed of an Ottoman future where the Sultan, knowing his successor was secure, could devote his energy to reform and governance rather than to controlling his brothers and sons. Yet their counsel often collided with the entrenched interests of those who thrived on ambiguity. Palace factions, military elites, and sometimes the sultans themselves, who feared that naming a clear heir might embolden that heir or those rallying behind him to move too soon. Over the centuries, this unresolved tension broke to the surface again and again in moments of crisis. A sultan died suddenly on campaign, and his sons raced toward the capital, each trying to reach the throne first. In the confusion, governors hesitated to send taxes or troops until they knew whom to recognize. Rebels timed their uprisings to coincide with transitions, gambling that the centre would be too distracted to respond decisively. In the provinces, ordinary people, farmers, artisans, merchants, felt these distant intrigues as something very real. Soldiers arriving late or not at all, bandits becoming bolder, prices rising as roads grew unsafe. Meanwhile, inside the metropolis, janissaries might rally to one prince, ulama to another, while the streets of Istanbul hummed with rumours. Each succession that slipped into turmoil left a faint scar, a slightly weaker treasury, a more divided army, a deeper habit of factionalism. The empire did not collapse from a single disputed throne, but every such moment shifted a little more sand from beneath its foundations. By the time later centuries arrived, the pattern was etched deeply into the empire's bones. Confinement of princes had ended the spectacle of brother killing brother on the battlefield, but it had not ended the cost. Now, instead of being hardened by provincial governorships and campaigns, future sultans often emerged from years, even decades of seclusion. Men whose education had been limited, whose emotional lives had narrowed to the routines of the harem and the whispers of a few attendants. When such a man stepped onto the throne, he carried both the weight of an ancient empire and the frailty of long isolation. Around him, experienced courtiers and military elites moved with practiced ease, ready to shape policy to their own advantage. What had begun in earlier centuries as a brutal but energetic competition among warrior princes hardened into something else, an aging system in which the most powerful man in the empire might be the least prepared to rule. And so, in the quiet of those palace corridors at night, one can almost feel the layers of consequence settling like dust. The original desire to protect the state at all costs, even at the price of blood, had curdled into chronic instability, mistrust, and stagnation. A clear law of succession might have spared the dynasty many of its worst crises, but the fear of limiting options kept that law from ever fully forming. The deadly mistake was not just the violence of fratricide or the stifling loneliness of the cage. It was the refusal, century after century, to resolve the question at the heart of power. As the empire moved forward, bruised by each uncertain transition, another danger was quietly maturing in the barracks and coffee houses of Istanbul, a force that had once been the the sharp sword of the sultans, and would slowly become something else entirely, waiting in the half-light for its own turn to shape the fate of the Ottoman world. Part 2, The Decline of the Janissaries. Tonight you're listening to part 2 of our long journey through the fatal mistakes of the Ottoman Empire, and in this chapter we'll drift slowly into the silent barracks of the Janissaries. Once the empire's proud, disciplined guardians, later a force whose privileges and resistance to change would shape the empire's fate in quiet, irreversible ways. In the hush of an Istanbul dawn, when mist still clings to the Bosphorus like a pale veil, it is easy to imagine the first generations of Janissaries wake into the soft beat of a drum, their steps steady, their breath calm, their minds aligned with duty. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were shaped from childhood, taken through the Dev Shirma system, converted, trained, disciplined, until their loyalty to the Sultan became something almost sacred. In those early centuries, their deepest desire was simple and powerful: to serve as the unbroken spine of the empire, to be the protectors who would carry the Ottomans through conquest after conquest, ensuring that no enemy could fracture the realm their sultans were building. They longed for discipline, honour, the pride of being unmatched in the field. Every motion in their drills, every beat of their marching rhythm echoed that hunger for excellence, and in their strength the empire grew tall. Yet within this same institution lived an inner struggle that none of them could fully name at first. Over time, as their reputation grew, so did their privileges. Their barracks became miniature worlds of their own, places where routine hardened into entitlement. Many Janissaries began to accumulate wealth, run businesses, own property, things that once had been forbidden. Their identity slowly shifted, and with it their inner compass. A tension took root deep inside them between the old disciplined ideal and the new comfort of influence. Some still felt the pull of the original calling, but others sensed how easily the system could be bent, how their collective power could override even the Sultan's will. In those moments of quiet rebellion, inside their hearts, they understood a tempting truth. The empire needed them, perhaps too much. Outside the barracks, the world was changing quickly. European armies were adopting new drills, new firearms, new formations based on continuous research and rapid innovation. The Ottomans' enemies were no longer the slow-moving medieval forces of the past. They were modernizing states driven by scientific curiosity and industrial ambition. As muskets grew more advanced and artillery reshaped warfare, the Janissaries' reluctance to adapt became a growing vulnerability. European courts watched closely. Ambassadors reported home that the once terrifying core was becoming conservative, resistant, unwilling to surrender privileges in exchange for progress. Rivals sensed opportunity. Whenever the empire faltered, whenever news of internal disputes surfaced, foreign commanders made careful notes, adjusting their strategies to this slow but spreading weakness. Even within the empire, pashas, viziers, and provincial elites understood that the Janissaries had become not only a military institution, but a political force, one capable of deciding the fate of reforms, rulers, and wars. There were those within the Ottoman heart who tried, with calm determination, to redirect this decline. Visionaries such as Selim III gathered thinkers, engineers, and officers who had studied European drills, hoping to rebuild the army with a more modern structure. They were allies of progress, quiet minds, dreaming of an empire that could carry its old glory into a new age without losing its soul. Their plans included new uniforms, new barracks, and modern weapons made with careful precision. These reformers hoped the Janissaries would understand that adaptation was not an insult to tradition, but its preservation. But the core, sensing a threat to their privileges, refused to bend. Some muttered in the coffee houses of Istanbul, others spread whispers of betrayal, claiming the new army would erase their honour. Their resistance grew sharper, harder, and soon the reformers found themselves standing against an immovable wall. When the clash finally came, it did not erupt like a dramatic battle, but unfolded slowly, in small bursts of defiance and occasional explosions of violence. Janissary rebellions lit up Istanbul at several key moments, each leaving scars upon the empire's memory. They deposed sultans, forced changes in government, halted reforms with the weight of collective will. In their refusal to modernize, they shaped the empire's path, forcing it onto an older road while the world marched ahead. Even ordinary citizens felt the consequences. Wars that should have been won dragged on or ended in defeats. Provinces that once fell easily into Ottoman hands now resisted fiercely. Merchants watched trade routes shift as the empire's power in the Mediterranean waned. Each riot, each refusal, each narrow barracks decision sent ripples across the land, weakening the empire not with a single devastating blow, but with countless small fractures. By the time Mahmud II saw clearly what had to be done, the empire had already paid a heavy price. The Janissaries had transformed into something the founders never intended, a privileged caste, resisting the very change the empire needed to survive. And in their final years, their once proud unity cracked further as younger members drifted toward comfort rather than discipline, and older ones clung to memories of glory without the strength to revive it. When the moment of the auspicious incident arrived, the air over Istanbul felt heavy with inevitability. The Janissaries' barracks, once symbols of unmatched power, now trembled under the weight of a future that no longer had room for them. Though Mahmud II's decisive action ended their dominance, it came far too late to repair the centuries of slow decline that their resistance had carved into the empire's body. As night deepens and the Bosphorus grows quiet beneath the moonlight, one can almost hear the faint echo of boots drilling on an old parade ground, the rhythm steady, the breath controlled, a memory of what the Janissaries once were. Their story is not merely one of corruption or privilege, but of how an institution born from discipline can, over time, drift from its own ideals until it becomes a barrier to the very survival it once protected. And from within the fading smoke of their final fall, the empire would turn toward another vulnerability, one rooted not in the barracks, but in the wider world of science, industry, and knowledge, where a new kind of challenge was silently forming, waiting for its turn to reshape the Ottoman destiny. Tonight, you're listening to part 3 of this quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's fatal mistakes, and in this part we'll drift gently into the world of science and industry, and how the empire slowly fell behind a changing age without ever fully realizing the cost. In the stillness of an early morning in Istanbul, long before the factories of Europe began belching steam and smoke, the city woke to older rhythms, the call to prayer drifting over tiled roofs, traders setting out their wares in narrow streets, scribes unrolling manuscripts beneath the faint light of oil lamps. For centuries, this world had felt sufficient, even abundant. Ottoman scholars translated, commented, and preserved older works of philosophy and law. Judges weighed cases with care, and artisans crafted objects of astonishing beauty. Within this environment lived a quiet desire to maintain balance, to keep the world as it had always been, ordered under faith and tradition. Many within the empire longed for continuity more than disruption. They wanted a society that remained recognizable to their fathers and grandfathers, where learning meant mastering what the ancients had already said, not venturing into the unknown with experiments, equations, and machines. That yearning for stability was gentle and understandable, but it carried, hidden deep within it, the seed of a deadly hesitation. Inside the minds of many scholars and officials, a subtle inner conflict began to form as news trickled in from Europe. Rumours of strange devices that could pump water, spin thread, or drive carriages without horses. Tales of observatories mapping the heavens with unprecedented precision, universities where theology now shared space with chemistry, physics, and mechanical engineering. Some Ottomans were curious. They asked themselves quietly, should we not also explore these paths? Could these discoveries serve the empire, strengthen its armies, enrich its cities? Yet at the same time, another voice whispered caution. Too much openness to foreign knowledge might be seen as doubting the sufficiency of inherited wisdom. New sciences were tangled with unfamiliar philosophies, sometimes with religious skepticism. For a judge trained in the fine points of law, for a scholar who had spent decades on commentaries, the idea that power now flowed from laboratories and factories rather than from ink and tradition stirred discomfort. The desire to protect the moral and spiritual fabric of the empire pressed against the growing awareness that the material world was changing fast. Beyond the empire's borders, those changes were relentless. In London, Manchester, and later in other European cities, engines roared to life, spinning cotton, forging steel, driving locomotives across entire continents. Cannons were cast with new precision, rifles gained range and accuracy, ships were armoured and powered by coal. The rivals of the Ottomans, once constrained by similar limitations of pre-industrial war, began to step into a new world, where Ottoman armies still relied heavily on older production methods. European powers developed arsenals where weapons flowed from mechanized workshops, where Ottoman transport strained under the slow pace of caravans and traditional ships. Foreign merchants and fleets harnessed steam to move faster than the wind. These external forces did not arrive at the empire's gates with immediate thunderous blows. They approached gradually, like a tide rising so slowly that those on the shore at first hardly felt it. But with each passing decade, the technological gap widened, and the empire's older patterns of life, once sufficient, began to feel like chains. Within the empire there were men and women who saw this clearly and tried to respond. Reform-minded statesmen, military officers who had trained abroad, translators who could read European texts, all of them formed a quiet constellation of allies for a different future. They dreamed of Ottoman factories humming with activity, of schools where geometry and astronomy stood beside religious law, of shipyards turning out steam-powered vessels bearing the crescent across distant seas. In new-founded institutions like engineering schools and translation bureaus, they worked to bring in textbooks, maps, technical manuals. They were careful with their words, framing change as a way to protect the empire rather than undermine it. If we do not learn these things, they would argue softly, our enemies will not wait for us. To preserve what we have, we must understand the world as it is becoming, not only as it once was. But they often found themselves facing not just budget constraints or logistical difficulties, but a deeper resistance lodged in the habits of centuries. That resistance was not always loud. Sometimes it appeared as simple refusal to fund new schools adequately, or as dismissive comments about foreign fashions and temporary trends. At other times, it broke to the surface more violently. The destruction of observatories, suspicion toward printing presses, opposition to sending students abroad. For some religious scholars, the fear was that new sciences might carry ideas that eroded belief. For some guilds, the fear was that machines would replace the craftsman's hand and unravel the social order that had sustained whole neighbourhoods. Even among the higher officials, many preferred to negotiate short-term loans or alliances with European powers rather than confront the unsettling reality that the empire would need to rewire its own inner life, its education, its economy, even its sense of time, to truly industrialize. And so at crucial moments when other states leaped forward, the Ottomans took only half steps, delaying deeper reforms for a later, more comfortable day that never really came. On battlefields, the cost of these choices became painfully visible. In wars against Russia, Austria, and other powers, Ottoman soldiers still fought with courage, but their courage met increasingly superior artillery, more efficient logistics, and generals who could move troops along railways and supply lines calculated with mathematical precision. Reports travelled back to Istanbul, detailing how enemy shells outranged Ottoman guns, how their ships moved upstream under their own power while Ottoman fleets struggled against the current and the wind. Each defeat carved another line into the empire's memory, a reminder that bravery alone could no longer offset the lack of industrial might. Yet, even these lessons, as cutting as they were, did not always translate into decisive internal transformation. The empire tried to import weapons, hire foreign advisors, patch gaps with external help, solutions that treated the symptoms but not the underlying illness. As the 19th century deepened, the empire's streets themselves began to reveal the imbalance. In certain districts, telegraph wires and modest railway stations appeared, tram lines clattered over cobblestones, foreign-owned factories rose near ports, visible symbols of modernity. But many of these advances were financed, controlled, or monopolized by European interests. Without a robust domestic industrial base, the Ottomans found themselves increasingly dependent on others for machinery, expertise, and credit. This dependence intertwined with unequal trade agreements and mounting debt, gradually eroding economic sovereignty. The missed opportunity to cultivate a broad scientific and industrial culture within the empire meant that when modernity did arrive, it often came wearing someone else's uniform, speaking someone else's language, and demanding terms that did not favour Istanbul. If you stand in imagination on a quiet hill overlooking the Bosphorus at twilight, you might picture two worlds overlapping. On one side, the familiar silhouettes of domes and minarets, the sound of evening prayers, the fragrance of bread and coffee rising from old neighbourhoods. On the other, in the distance, the faint outline of smokestacks and rail lines, ships of iron and steam sliding across the horizon. The Ottomans, loving the First World and wary of the Second, hesitated too long at the threshold. Their desire to guard the soul of their society is something we can understand, but the price of that hesitation was severe. For by the time the empire truly tried to close the gap, the industrialized powers had already rewritten the rules of war, trade, and influence. And out on the restless seas and along the busy quays of Mediterranean ports, another danger was already pressing closer. Not just machines and engines, but legal and economic agreements that would quietly open the empire's markets to others, tying its hands with paper chains that would prove almost as binding as any chain of iron. Tonight, you're listening to part 4 of this slow journey through the Ottoman Empire's fatal mistakes, and in this part, we'll drift into something that doesn't crash like a cannon or shout like a rebellion, but whispers on paper, the capitulations, those commercial privileges to foreign powers that slowly tangled the empire in threads it could no longer cut. In the beginning, these agreements did not look like a trap. They were born in an age when Ottoman power still loomed high over the Mediterranean, when foreign ambassadors bowed carefully in the great halls of Topkapi, and merchants from Venice, France, and England waited nervously for the Sultan's favour. The empire's rulers desired stable trade more than anything else in this realm of shifting wars. Safe routes for caravans, busy ports, full markets, and a steady river of customs duties flowing into the treasury. To encourage this, the sultans granted certain privileges, reduced taxes, legal protections, the right for foreign subjects to be judged by their own consuls. At first, it felt like an act of confident generosity, as though the empire was saying, "We are so strong that we can afford to be gracious." Yet, even as these agreements multiplied, a quieter unease began to stir in the minds of some officials. Deep inside the administrative machinery, there were men in the chancery and the divan who could see patterns that others ignored. They noticed how often foreign merchants used their privileges to bypass local taxes, how disputes involving Europeans slipped away from Ottoman courts into the hands of consuls and foreign judges. A tension grew between the desire to maintain friendly relations, to keep the ports humming, and the knowledge that each new clause signed away a little more control. Some bureaucrats must have asked themselves, in the privacy of their own thoughts, if our own subjects are judged one way and theirs another, if our own traders pay full tax and theirs do not, what will this look like in 50 or 100 years? But their questions were easily drowned out by short-term needs, debts to be paid, allies to be satisfied, wars to be financed with loans whose terms were easier to accept if the lenders received yet more protections. Beyond the empire's borders, European powers watched the growth of these capitulations with careful satisfaction. To them, they were not mere legal curiosities, they were tools. As European economies industrialized and their merchants searched for new markets, the Ottoman realms promised rich rewards: grain from Anatolia, cotton from Egypt, minerals and raw materials from every corner of the Sultan's dominions, and millions of potential customers for factory-made goods. With each new treaty, foreign governments gained leverage. If Istanbul hesitated to renew or extend privileges, diplomats could hint at naval pressure, at support for troublesome neighbours, at the possibility of favouring a rival power instead. Step by step, what had once been a symbol of Ottoman generosity turned into a structural advantage for others, a set of rules written on Ottoman soil that, in practice, answered to foreign capitals. Inside the empire, there were still allies of a different path. Reformers during the Tanzimat era, financial advisors, and even some merchants understood that true strength meant regaining economic sovereignty. They proposed revising the capitulations, modernizing the tax system, and building domestic industries that could compete with imported goods. They dreamed of Ottoman factories weaving textiles, casting tools, and producing ships' fittings, rather than relying on bales and crates coming in under the protective umbrella of foreign flags. They argued that the law should apply more evenly, that no foreign subject should be entirely beyond the reach of local justice, that the empire had to reclaim its right to regulate trade in its own ports. But whenever they tried to move from dreams to decrees, they faced a wall of resistance, not only from outside powers determined to keep their advantages, but also from internal groups who had learned to profit from the existing arrangements. For local intermediaries, bankers, brokers, large merchants who worked with foreign houses, the capitulations were not chains at all, but ladders. They could operate under the umbrella of European protection, tap into foreign credit, and move goods along networks that ordinary Ottoman traders could scarcely access. For the central treasury, short-term relief from foreign loans, often negotiated in the language of friendship and mutual interest, appeared more attractive than the long, difficult work of raising internal revenue and building industry. Thus an internal contradiction deepened. The very agreements that seemed to alleviate immediate financial pressure were quietly eroding the empire's ability to stand on its own feet. As decades passed, small legal advantages accumulated into a heavy imbalance. When disputes arose between Ottoman officials and foreign merchants, embassies intervened. When local courts ruled in ways that displeased foreign interests, protests followed. Ports like Izmir, Salonika, and Alexandria buzzed with activity, but much of the profit and legal authority flowed outward rather than inward. The empire's own citizens watched as foreign companies built infrastructure, ran shipping lines, and dominated certain trades, shielded by capitulations that limited what Ottoman law could do. On paper, the Sultan remained sovereign over his lands. In practice, large sections of the economy operated under a patchwork of exemptions, like islands of foreign privilege scattered across an Ottoman sea. When the financial crises of the 19th century struck, the weakness became impossible to ignore. Revenues were insufficient, debts piled up, and foreign creditors demanded guarantees. In response, the empire was compelled to grant more intrusive forms of control, international commissions to supervise tax collection, customs revenues effectively pledged to pay interest abroad. The capitulations, once merely commercial and legal privileges, were now part of a larger pattern of dependency. Ordinary people felt this not in diplomatic phrases, but in rising taxes, in cuts to services, in the quiet knowledge that decisions about their economy were increasingly shaped in distant chancelleries. Meanwhile, nationalist movements within the empire looked at these arrangements and saw yet another sign that the old order could no longer protect their interests, adding fuel to their demands for separation or radical change. If you imagine, for a moment, standing on a crowded quay in one of the empire's great ports at sunset, you might see the picture with a strange clarity. Ships from many nations lie at anchor, their flags catching the last light. Crates are unloaded, contracts signed, disputes settled, not always in Ottoman courts, but in consular offices bearing foreign coats of arms. The harbour is alive, money is changing hands, and on the surface everything seems prosperous. Yet beneath that surface, the terms of trade, the flow of profits, and the reach of law no longer fully belong to the empire whose land supports it all. The deadly mistake was not in making a single treaty or in showing hospitality to foreign merchants. It was in allowing those temporary privileges to harden into permanent structures, signed and renewed again and again until they constrained almost every attempt at genuine reform. And as the empire gazed outward at a world of treaties and tariffs, thinking that it could manage its way back to balance with words and signatures, another danger was taking shape closer to home, in the shaky arithmetic of its own finances, in the leaking barrels of its tax system, and in a treasury that would soon discover just how costly long-term dependency could become. Tonight you're listening to part 5 of this quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we will walk slowly into the empire's own treasury to watch how numbers on parchment, taxes in distant villages, and loans inked in far-off capitals quietly weakened the great house from within. In the beginning, the Ottoman financial system did not look fragile at all. For centuries, land taxes, customs duties, and the spoils of conquest had flowed toward the centre like streams feeding a wide, calm lake. The Sultan, in theory, stood at the heart of a carefully ordered system, timar grants that rewarded cavalrymen with taxable lands, tax farmers who gathered revenues on behalf of the state, and officials trained to record and allocate these sums. Within this structure lived a simple but powerful desire to keep the state supplied so that it could feed its armies, maintain its roads, and sustain the court that symbolized imperial majesty. For many generations, that desire seemed fulfilled. Campaigns paid for themselves, Newly conquered territories added fresh income, and the treasury could breathe easily. The calm surface of the lake hid the fact that its sources were not infinite, and that one day the current of conquest would slow. Deep within the empire's own administrative mind, a quieter tension formed as the centuries passed. Officials who worked with ledgers and census records could see how much of the state's income depended on arrangements that were increasingly hard to monitor. Tax farmers in remote provinces squeezed peasants for more than the official rates, pocketing the difference. Local magnates treated tax rights as personal property, and some governors delayed or diverted funds, confident that the centre could not easily check their behaviour. The system still functioned, but with growing leaks. Those who cared about the state's long-term health must have felt an inner conflict. They wanted to enforce discipline, to audit, to reform, yet they also feared provoking the very notables, whose cooperation kept the countryside relatively calm. Each year, compromises were made. Each year, small losses were accepted in the name of short-term stability. The healthy fear of disorder slowly outweighed the responsibility to repair the system that fed the army and the bureaucracy. Beyond the empire's frontiers, other states were learning to count in new ways. In European capitals, ministries of finance developed more centralised systems of taxation, state banks emerged, and public debt was managed, however imperfectly, with new tools of accounting and oversight. Industrialising economies widened their tax base as factories, wages and trade expanded, giving governments more flexible revenue sources. At the same time, these powers were growing more skilled at lending money abroad on terms that favoured their own interests. When the Ottomans went to war, or needed to build railways and modernise their armies without first repairing their tax structure, foreign bankers and governments were ready with offers of credit. The external world presented itself as a helping hand, but carried in its outstretched fingers a set of contracts that would tighten around the empire's finances in years to come. Inside the Ottoman elite, there were still allies of a wiser path. Some reformers argued for a more direct tax system, for reducing the role of middlemen, for conducting accurate surveys of land and population so that the burden could be shared more fairly. They dreamed of a treasury that did not need to sell tax rights cheaply up front in order to pay its bills, a budget that could be planned beyond the emergency of the next campaign or the next loan payment. These men recommended cutting unnecessary court expenditures, limiting the extravagance of certain offices, and investing in revenue-producing infrastructure rather than ceremonial display. Their voices, often patient and precise, sketched a vision of an empire that lived within its means and could borrow, when necessary, from a position of strength rather than desperation. But their proposals had to pass through a maze of established interests. Tax farmers who benefited from the old system, provincial notables wary of losing income, court factions attached to their stipends and privileges. The more deeply the leaks were woven into the fabric of the state, the harder it became to close them without tearing that fabric apart. As the 19th century approached, the arithmetic of decline became more visible. Military defeats, rising administrative costs, and the expense of tentative modernising projects pushed the empire to borrow heavily from European capital markets. Each loan, taken in a moment of pressing need, carried interest rates and conditions that made repayment difficult. When revenues fell short, the simplest answer was often to seek yet another loan, or to grant further economic concessions in exchange for temporary relief. In distant villages, peasants felt this not in the language of bonds and percentages, but in higher taxes and harsher collection. They watched as local officials demanded more coin, more grain, more animals to cover obligations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. In the cities, merchants saw customs duties and internal tolls shift in confusing patterns, shaped as much by the demands of foreign creditors as by the needs of local trade. The treasury, meant to be the steady heart of the state, began to beat in a nervous, irregular rhythm. Eventually, the strain could no longer be hidden inside ledgers. The empire's partial default in the 1870s and the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration made the loss of financial autonomy painfully concrete. Representatives of foreign powers now oversaw key revenue streams, salt taxes, tobacco monopolies, certain customs duties, ensuring that debt payments were honoured even if domestic needs went unmet. For ordinary subjects, this arrangement was largely invisible in its details, but its effects were real. Funds that might have been used for schools, roads and reforms were instead channeled outward to distant creditors. Within the empire, some began to whisper that their own state could no longer fully decide how to use the money collected in its name. For nationalist movements and disillusioned elites alike, this loss of control confirmed a deeper fear, that the empire had become, in part, a steward of other people's interests. If you imagine, in the quiet of your own thoughts, a clerk sitting late at night in a dim office in Istanbul, hunched over rows of numbers by the light of a single lamp, you might glimpse the human face of this mistake. He adds columns of figures, notes shortfalls, drafts reports, proposes modest economies, all with the hope that careful management might still turn the tide. Yet above him, powerful men debate wars, alliances, and prestige projects that far exceed the modest savings he can suggest. The empire's financial weakness is no longer just a technical matter. It has become a structural vulnerability that shapes diplomacy, war, and even the daily rhythm of life for farmers and shopkeepers. The deadly nature of the mistake lies not in one foolish expenditure or one reckless loan, but in the long habit of patching, postponing, and hoping that tomorrow's revenues or tomorrow's lenders will solve today's problems. And as the Treasury's windows darken and the clerk finally sets down his pen, another set of pressures is already forming elsewhere in the empire, pressures rooted not only in coin and credit, but in the restless hearts of diverse peoples who are beginning to ask whether this burdened, indebted state can still speak for them, or whether their future lies along a different path entirely. Tonight you're listening to part 6 of this journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll wander slowly along the empire's borders themselves to feel what happens when a state stretches across 3 continents, further and further, until its own reach becomes a quiet threat to its survival. In a dim chamber of the palace, where maps are spread across a low table lit by a single lamp, one can imagine an Ottoman statesman standing alone, his gaze drifting over inked coastlines and mountain ranges. From the Danube to the Nile, from the gates of Vienna down to the deserts of Arabia, from Algiers in the far west to the frontier with Persia in the east, the empire seems to expand without end. The paper glows warmly in the lamplight. Tiny symbols mark fortresses, caravan routes, ports, and mountain passes. Within that view lives a powerful, almost intoxicating desire to hold it all together, to be the ruler who can say that from sunrise to sunset, the paths of merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers all run under one sovereign shadow. For generations, sultans and viziers longed to secure this vast realm, to protect holy cities, control key straits, and keep enemies at a respectful distance. Expansion was not just greed, it was also fear turned outward, the belief that only by pushing the frontier farther could the heartland remain safe. But even as flags rose over new provinces, an internal unease began to take shape in the minds of those who actually had to govern them. Governors, dispatched to distant Yemen, Baghdad, or Bosnia, felt the gap between the ideal of centralized control and the reality of rugged landscapes, stubborn local powers, and long chains of command. Messages could take weeks or months to travel. By the time an order arrived from Istanbul, conditions on the ground might have changed entirely. Officials responsible for tax collection struggled to reconcile the demands of the treasury with the fragile rhythms of local agriculture and trade. In their hearts, many must have felt a deep private conflict. They wanted to be faithful servants of the Sultan, to keep every district firmly tied to the centre, yet they knew attention and resources were always thinner at the fringes. Each year, they patched things together, with compromises, bargains, and personal networks, aware that the empire's arms were stretched wider than its strength. Beyond those shifting frontiers, enemies and rivals watched with a patient, calculating eye. To the west, Habsburg commanders tested the Ottoman hold on Hungary and the Balkans, pressing whenever they sensed weakness. To the east, the Safavids and later other Persian dynasties probed the frontiers of Iraq and eastern Anatolia, vying for influence over border tribes and holy cities. In the north, Russia grew steadily stronger, reaching first for the Black Sea shorelines and then beyond, determined to present itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule. Even on the seas, corsairs, local warlords, and European navies turned the coasts of North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean into a chessboard where the empire's fleet was only one among many players. Every stretch of new territory invited not just prestige, but new threats, mountain rebels, tribal confederations, foreign agents. The more lines the map displayed, the more directions from which danger could approach. Inside the empire, there were still allies of cohesion who tried to weave this vast tapestry into something durable. Capable grand viziers and provincial governors worked to improve roads, secure caravan routes, and strengthen fortresses. Postal relays and couriers carried orders and reports as quickly as hoof and sail allowed. In some regions, wise administrators forged partnerships with local notables, acknowledging their influence in exchange for loyalty and tax revenues. They dreamed of a balanced arrangement in which Istanbul's authority was respected, but regional customs and power structures were not needlessly trampled. These men, many of them unknown to history's grand narratives, were the quiet glue of the empire, holding together distant regions through negotiation more than sheer force. But even their best efforts were limited by time, distance, and the endless demands of war. Every campaign on one frontier meant fewer troops and less attention for another. Every emergency in Europe could leave Arabia or North Africa feeling neglected, and vice versa. Over the centuries, this pattern produced a slow-burning strain. In some provinces, ambitious local families began to treat their governorships as hereditary possessions, building private armies, levying extra taxes, and cultivating their own diplomatic contacts. They still invoked the Sultan's name, still hoisted his flag, but their real loyalties were often to their own house and region. The Senate responded with alternating gestures of severity and accommodation, sending troops to rein in one powerful notable, confirming the privileges of another when circumstances left no better choice. Each such bargain helped the empire survive the moment, but also normalized a looser, more fragmented reality. The Ottoman dream of a tightly woven, centrally directed realm gave way to something messier, a patchwork of semi-autonomous zones, tied to Istanbul by ritual and habit as much as by genuine administrative control. As modern warfare and diplomacy evolved, the cost of this overextension became more obvious. In conflicts that erupted across multiple fronts, the empire found itself perpetually short of men, money, and time. Troops dispatched from Anatolia to put down rebellions in the Balkans could not simultaneously reinforce garrisons facing Russia. efforts to reassert control over distant provinces like Egypt or Arabia demanded enormous resources, often at moments when the treasury was already strained and the army in need of modernisation. When the French invaded Egypt at the end of the 18th century, they exposed not only military weaknesses but also the fragility of Ottoman sovereignty in a province that had long been both vital and restive. Each crisis revealed the same underlying truth. The empire was trying to be everywhere at once, without the administrative, financial and technological foundation to match its geographic ambitions. In the daily lives of ordinary subjects, this overreach showed itself in quieter, more personal ways. A peasant in the Balkans might see imperial troops march through his village more often than before, as the state tried to hold the line against both foreign armies and local insurgents. A merchant in Aleppo might find that the security of roads rose and fell with the fortunes of distant campaigns, making his trade routes uncertain. A tribesman in Arabia might perceive that Istanbul's authority was strong when it suited the empire's strategic needs, and weak when it did not, encouraging him to rely more on local chiefs than on distant promises. Over time, such experiences taught many communities a subtle lesson. The empire was grand but not omnipresent, powerful but not always attentive. And in that gap between the ideal of a universal ruler and the reality of uneven, sometimes absent governance, new identities and loyalties began to grow. By the 19th century, maps of the Ottoman world, once drawn with smooth, confident borders, began to change more frequently. Provinces slipped away, some seized by foreign powers, others breaking off under the banner of nationalism. Each loss was painful, but it was also the visible expression of pressures that had been building for generations. The deadly mistake lay not simply in conquering too much, but in clinging to distant territories without building the robust institutions needed to hold them: schools, roads, fair taxation, shared political participation, relying instead on old patterns of military presence and personal patronage. As the empire tried to maintain its long arms in an age of railways, telegraphs and mass politics, it found itself stretched between worlds, still imagining itself as the guardian of a vast universal realm, while more and more of its subjects quietly learned to think in narrower, more local, more national terms. If you close your eyes and picture that lonely statesman again, standing over his map by lamplight, you might see his hand hovering uncertainly over the furthest frontiers, a sweep of his fingers across the Balkans, the Levant, North Africa. He knows that each region is a story of its own, with its own languages, memories and grievances. He feels the weight of trying to hold them all together, even as the tools at his disposal feel old and dull against the sharp edges of a changing world. The empire's reach, once its pride, has become its burden. And out along those borderlands, in mountain villages, seaport neighbourhoods and quiet valleys, people are beginning to whisper in different tongues about their own destinies, their own flags, their own visions of the future. The first murmurs of a new force that will soon test the empire from within. The rise of ethnic and religious nationalism, turning long suppressed tensions into open, shattering demands for separation and self-rule. Tonight you're listening to part 7 of this journey through the Ottoman Empire's fatal mistakes, and in this part we'll move gently inside the empire's mosaic of peoples and faiths to watch how the handling of ethnic and religious diversity slowly shifted from a source of strength into a quiet, breaking fault line. For centuries, one of the striking things about the Ottoman world was how many different lives it could hold at once. In the same city, a call to prayer might float over tiled rooftops while church bells rang in a nearby quarter. Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, Slavs, Albanians, Turks, Jews, and many others walked the same streets and traded in the same markets. Within this tapestry, the empire's rulers carried a deep desire to be seen as the protector of all these communities, so long as they accepted the Sultan's authority and paid their taxes. The millet system, with its semi-autonomous religious communities, offered a way to let different groups govern parts of their own lives while remaining under a single imperial roof. It was not equality in a modern sense, but for its time it created a workable peace, one in which difference could exist without immediately tearing the state apart. Yet, even in those earlier centuries, there was an inner tension that few could fully name. Being tolerated is not the same as feeling fully valued, and being protected is not the same as sharing real power. Many non-Muslim communities carried a quiet awareness of their subordinate status, extra taxes, limitations in office holding, the knowledge that final authority always rested with Muslim judges and imperial officials. This produced a complicated blend of gratitude and restraint, of belonging and distance. A Christian merchant in Salonika or a Jewish doctor in Istanbul might appreciate the safety and opportunity the empire allowed, yet still feel a subtle line he could not cross, a ceiling he could not break. Outside the empire's borders, the winds of nationalism were beginning to blow more strongly. In Europe, new ideas about peoplehood, language, and sovereignty were taking shape. Arguments that a nation defined by shared ethnicity and culture had a right to its own state. As neighbours of the Ottomans embraced these ideas, and in some cases used them to break away from older empires, foreign powers began to look at the Ottoman mosaic not just as a curiosity, but as an opportunity. Russia cast itself as the defender of Orthodox Christians. France and others spoke of protecting Catholics or certain minority groups. These actors often used real grievances as openings for influence, sending money, weapons, and pamphlets into Ottoman lands. The empire, used to thinking of communities in terms of religion and loyalty to the Sultan, now faced a new question. What happens when people begin to think of themselves not as subjects of a ruler, but as members of a nation with its own destiny? Inside the imperial centre, some tried to respond with foresight. Reformers of the 19th century believed that the only way to preserve the state was to create a more inclusive sense of Ottoman citizenship, one that would reduce the legal gap between Muslims and non-Muslims and offer all subjects a stake in the empire's future. They hoped that by granting more equal rights, by opening schools and administrative posts more widely, they could renew loyalty and weaken the appeal of separatist nationalism. These men, drafting reform edicts and new laws late into the night, were allies of a more cohesive vision, an identity that could wrap itself around many ethnicities without erasing them. But they were caught between two currents. On one side, European states pressing them to go further and faster. On the other, conservative elements fearful that levelling the legal field would weaken the special position of Muslims and threaten the religious foundations of the state. That conflict rippled through hearts and neighbourhoods. Many Muslims, especially in Anatolia and the Balkans, had given sons and wealth for the empire's wars. They had long understood themselves as the backbone of a state built in the name of Islam. When reforms hinted that non-Muslims would now share more equally in rights, some felt an anxious question rise within. Would they also share equally in duties, in military service, in sacrifice? At the same time, many Christians and other minorities saw reforms as promises rarely kept in full or applied unevenly. Their own inattention grew. Hope when new decrees were announced, disappointment when local officials ignored them, and anger when foreign powers claimed to speak in their name while pursuing their own agendas. Between fear and frustration, mutual trust eroded. As the century turned and pressures mounted, the empire's handling of these diversities grew harsher and more brittle. In the Balkans, Uprisings and brutal reprisals marked a painful cycle. Village revolts met with military force, atrocities committed on all sides, foreign newspapers seizing on each horror to denounce the empire and justify further interference. In eastern Anatolia and other regions, tensions between Armenians and state forces, complicated by banditry, local feuds, and outside agitation, erupted into episodes of mass violence whose scars have never fully healed. What had once been managed through negotiation and paternalistic tolerance was now approached increasingly through suspicion, surveillance, and force. The deadly mistake lay not only in the bloodshed itself, but in the failure to imagine and build a political order in which the empire's many peoples could feel genuinely represented rather than merely controlled. Yet even in those darkening years, there were still voices calling for a different path. Intellectuals, journalists, and some officials argued for a civic identity that would place shared loyalty above ethnic and religious lines. They wrote of a future in which Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and others might all see themselves as equal citizens under a constitutional framework. For a brief time, especially around the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, there was a fragile sense that such a future might be possible, a moment when crowds in Istanbul cheered together, when old distinctions seemed, just for a while, to soften. But underneath the celebrations remained unresolved questions: economic inequalities, resentments over past injustices, divergent dreams about what freedom and nation should mean. Without deeper reconciliation, the hopeful words could not bear the weight placed upon them. When war finally came on a global scale, these internal fractures widened drastically. Under the stress of defeat, invasion, and fears of disloyalty, the imperial leadership made decisions that deepened the wounds between communities. Populations were uprooted, lives shattered, trust broken, especially in regions where competing national projects collided most violently. By the time the war ended, much of the old Ottoman mosaic lay in pieces. New borders were drawn, new states were proclaimed in the language of national self-determination, and millions of former subjects found themselves suddenly counted as members of new nations, sometimes welcomed, sometimes treated as strangers in places their families had lived for generations. If you picture, for a quiet moment, a narrow street in a once mixed Ottoman town at dusk, perhaps in the Balkans or along the eastern borderlands, you might still hear the fading echoes of different tongues and prayers that once coexisted there. Lamps are being lit behind shutters, but in many houses the families who used to gather around those lights are gone, moved away, expelled, or folded into new national stories that no longer remember the empire as home. The deadly mistake was not in governing a diverse world, for that was one of the empire's early strengths, but in failing to transform an old hierarchical model of tolerance into a shared modern sense of belonging before the storms of nationalism arrived. And as the empire's human landscape fractured, another problem, rooted not in peoples but in the very machinery of rule, in the slow decay of its own bureaucracy and the spread of corruption, was quietly tightening its grip on what remained of the Ottoman state. Tonight you're listening to part 8 of this journey through the Ottoman Empire's fatal mistakes, and in this part we'll step softly into the dim offices, echoing corridors, and crowded petition halls of the empire's own administration, to watch how a once living machinery of rule slowly stiffened into something heavy, corrupt, and hard to move. In the early, vigorous centuries of the empire, the bureaucracy felt almost like a disciplined orchestra. Scribes sat cross-legged over low desks, their reed pens gliding across paper, recording land grants, tax registers, decrees from the Sultan. Provincial reports arrived in bundles, sealed and ribboned, Orders went out with the authority of a state that still believed deeply in its own capacity to command. Within that world, many officials carried a sincere desire to serve, a wish to bring order to distant districts, to maintain fairness in tax collection, to see that the Sultan's will reached even the smallest village. A young clerk entering service might dream of rising by merit, mastering the language of law and finance, one day becoming a respected defterdar or governor whose decisions would hold real weight. This inner yearning for competence, recognition, and usefulness gave the early Ottoman administration a certain quiet strength. But even in those promising days, another feeling lived just beneath the surface. Some posts were more desirable than others. Some appointments owed more to patronage than to ability. A clerk might notice that promotions flowed more easily to those with connections at court, that certain families seemed always to occupy the same positions, that favours and gifts could smooth or block the path of a petition. Over time, this awareness hardened into a painful inner conflict. Should one rely on talent and honour service, or learn the art of flattery and alliance building? As the empire grew and its demands multiplied, the temptation to use office as a ladder for private gain crept gently into more hearts. What began as small gifts of gratitude slipped toward expectations. What began as an occasional bending of rules became a habit, then a norm. The administration did not suddenly turn corrupt. It drifted. And that drift, year after year, was one of its deadliest quiet mistakes. Beyond the empire's borderlands, states that competed with the Ottomans were also reshaping their administrations. In Vienna, Berlin, and later in other European capitals, rulers and ministers pushed, sometimes clumsily, sometimes ruthlessly, to centralise authority, standardise procedures, and build what they called modern bureaucracies. They too struggled with favouritism and graft, but they increasingly tied promotion to training, education, and length of service. Military academies, civil service examinations, and specialised ministries began to professionalise the art of governance. Foreign observers who visited Istanbul and provincial capitals could sense the contrast. A complex, deeply rooted Ottoman administrative system, rich in tradition and ceremonial, but often slow to adapt, cluttered with overlapping offices, and vulnerable to personal influence at every level. For rival powers, this was more than a curiosity. A state with a tied bureaucracy is a state that reacts slowly, that enforces inconsistently, that can be pressured more easily in diplomacy and outmaneuvered in war. Inside the empire, reformers saw this clearly and tried again and again to bring fresh air into the system. During the Tanzimat and later periods, statesmen pushed for new codes, clearer chains of command, restructured ministries. They founded modern schools for civil servants, translated European legal and administrative texts, and tried to update the way the empire counted its people, its land, its revenues. These men were allies of renewal, people who still believed that the Ottoman state could be made efficient and fair without losing its soul. They spent long nights drafting regulations that limited tax farming abuses, that standardised court procedures, that curtailed the more blatant forms of extortion. In their minds, the bureaucracy did not have to be a burden. It could become, again, a disciplined instrument of a reformed empire. But each new set of rules, each reorganisation, had to pass through layers of men who had grown comfortable in the old way of doing things. For many of those men, the bureaucracy had become less a calling and more a shield. A provincial tax collector knew that his position gave him bargaining power with local notables and peasants alike. A judge understood that litigants might be willing to sweeten the outcome of their cases. A customs official in a busy port saw endless opportunities to look the other way for a fee. To such figures, reform was not a noble ideal, it was a threat. They had built networks of dependency, clients, relatives, allies who relied on the extra coins and favours that leaked from the state's veins. When edicts came from Istanbul demanding stricter accounting, fairer assessments, or the removal of certain abuses, these networks did not simply dissolve. They resisted quietly through delays, partial compliance, and the quiet killing of new rules by ignoring them. On paper, the bureaucracy might look reformed. In practice, old habits flowed stubbornly beneath the surface, like groundwater under cracked stone. The consequences rippled outward into the daily lives of ordinary people. A farmer in Anatolia might read or hear secondhand about decrees promising more just taxation, only to find that his local collector still demanded more than the official rate. A merchant in Damascus might know that trade regulations had been updated, yet discover that each checkpoint still required a gift to pass smoothly. A minority community might be told that new laws guaranteed their security, yet learn that protection still depended on the goodwill of this or that local official. Such experiences bred a weary cynicism, the sense that the state spoke one language in its proclamations and another in its actual behaviour. As trust in the bureaucracy eroded, so did loyalty to the empire itself. People looked increasingly to local patrons, religious leaders, or foreign consuls, anyone who seemed able to make the administration listen, to shield them from arbitrary decisions. Under the strain of external wars and internal unrest, the decaying bureaucracy became a liability in crisis. When rebellions broke out, reports might be slow, incomplete, or quietly adjusted to protect local officials from blame. When reforms required accurate data on land, population, or revenue, the state often had to work from outdated or manipulated records. Corruption in military supply chains meant that soldiers could arrive at the front with poor equipment or missing pay, undermining morale before a single shot was fired. At key moments, the empire needed an administration that could respond quickly, honestly, and coherently. Instead, it often found itself tangled in its own paperwork, with overlapping authorities and hidden interests pulling in different directions. Yet even in this weary, compromised system, you can still imagine individuals who tried to do their work well. A district governor who refused bribes and made enemies because of it, a judge who insisted on applying the law fairly, a clerk who kept accurate registers despite pressure to alter them. Their efforts, like small lamps in a large dim hall, offered islands of integrity. But isolated lamps cannot light an entire building when the walls themselves are absorbing the light. Without a broader institutional culture that rewarded and protected such integrity, these men were vulnerable, transferred, sidelined, or quietly punished when their honesty threatened more powerful interests. The state needed them desperately, yet it often failed to defend them. By the dawn of the 20th century, the administrative decay had entwined itself with all the other pressures the empire faced: nationalist ferment, military challenges, foreign encroachment, attempts to impose constitutional rule, to create representative institutions, and to modernize law, all ran up against the same entrenched habits. Elections could be manipulated, laws selectively enforced, budgets quietly adjusted in committee rooms far from public view. Each new layer of reform, instead of replacing the old, sometimes simply added complexity atop corruption, making the machinery heavier without making it more just. The deadly nature of this mistake lay not only in wasted money or delayed orders, but in the gradual loss of something harder to measure: the belief among subjects that the state was capable of honest, effective action in their name. If you picture, very quietly, a long corridor in an imperial ministry at the end of the day, the lamps burning low, stacks of files leaning precariously on wooden shelves, ink-stained desks abandoned until morning, you might sense the exhaustion of an old organism that has carried more than it can bear. Outside those walls, the empire's borders are under pressure, its economy strained, its peoples restless. Inside, the machinery meant to coordinate a response grinds slowly, clogged with paper, favours, fears, and old habits. And as night deepens over Istanbul, another part of the imperial system, less visible than soldiers on parade or officials at their desks, but just as crucial, is also falling behind. The world of education and knowledge, where the minds that might have renewed this bureaucracy are being shaped by an older, narrower curriculum, leaving the empire short of the kind of thinkers it will soon desperately need. Tonight you're listening to part 9 of this quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll walk slowly into the schools, libraries and study halls of the empire to see how the way it taught its children and trained its elites drifted out of step with a changing world, leaving it short of the minds it needed most when the storms came. In the early centuries, the Ottoman world possessed a rich culture of learning that felt, to those who lived inside it, complete and sufficient. In the courtyards of madrasas, under the shade of cloisters and plane trees, students sat in circles around respected teachers copying passages of law, theology, and classical commentary. They memorized verses, debated points of jurisprudence, and learned the etiquette of scholarly life. In these spaces lived a noble desire to understand God's will, to produce judges and scholars who could guide the community with wisdom, and to preserve a living thread that ran back through the great traditions of the Islamic past. The path of learning promised spiritual honor and social respect, and for a long time the curriculum felt like the surest way to cultivate an ordered and righteous society. Yet inside this world, a quiet unease gradually formed, even if only a few could name it clearly. As the centuries passed, the curriculum changed very little, and the boundaries of legitimate knowledge remained narrow. A talented student who felt curiosity about astronomy beyond the old tables, about medicine grounded in new anatomy, or about the hidden laws of motion and matter, often found there were few teachers and fewer books to guide him. He might hear rumours of experiments in distant lands, of lenses that revealed unseen worlds, of calculations that traced the paths of planets with uncanny precision. A small voice inside could whisper, "There is more." But another voice, of habit, of caution, of fear of straying beyond what elders considered safe, told him to return to the well-trodden path. This tension between curiosity and conformity, repeated in generation after generation, slowly thinned the ranks of those willing to explore beyond inherited knowledge. Outside the empire, the map of learning was being redrawn. Universities in Europe, once bound by their own scholastic frameworks, opened themselves to experiment, observation, and the systematic study of nature. Laboratories, observatories, and technical schools multiplied. Printing presses poured out new treatises at a pace manuscript copying could not match. States that embraced scientific education saw their power multiplied. By contrast, Ottoman institutions that stayed focused on a narrow set of disciplines produced men still learned in their own terms, but increasingly ill-equipped to grapple with the new languages of power: chemistry, mechanics, ballistics, political economy, and emerging social sciences. Inside the empire, reformers saw the danger and tried to respond. Some were statesmen pushing for modern military and engineering schools. Others were intellectuals who translated European works or founded new academies in Istanbul and provincial cities. They wanted to weave together the old and the new, to keep the ethical and spiritual depth of the traditional curriculum while adding mathematics, geography, physics, and foreign languages. In their dreams, the empire would produce a generation of officials who could read both the Quran and a technical manual. These people were allies of a more balanced future, drafting plans, persuading patrons, and opening modest institutions that sometimes began with just a handful of teachers and students, but their efforts had to move through a society pulled in different directions. Many religious scholars feared that new subjects, especially when taught from foreign books, might smuggle in skepticism or undermine established hierarchies. Parents worried that an education in strange sciences and foreign tongues might detach their children from their community's values. Some conservative officials saw no urgent need to upset familiar patterns when the empire already had judges, scribes, and soldiers in the old mould. Resistance did not always come as open denunciation. It often appeared as polite delay, as half-hearted support, as underfunded schools that existed more on paper than in reality. Even where modern institutions were founded, they were sometimes isolated islands in a sea of older education, their graduates eyed with suspicion or used in narrowly defined roles. The result was an uneven intellectual landscape. A few bright clusters of modern education appeared: military academies, medical schools, technical institutes, producing officers and professionals who read foreign journals and corresponded with colleagues abroad. Yet the broader fabric of schooling, especially in the countryside and many urban neighbourhoods, remained tied to rote learning and old texts. For a village child, basic literacy might still be out of reach. For a promising adolescent, access to a modern school could depend on family connections, money, or the accident of living near one of the rare reformed institutions. The empire found itself with too few people trained to manage railways, conduct censuses, design factories, or negotiate complex treaties. It had many men skilled in the rhetoric of older scholarship, but far fewer who could calculate the stresses on a bridge or the implications of an international loan agreement. This gap deepened dependence on foreigners and on a narrow elite. When new technologies needed to be installed, foreign engineers were often hired. When statistics had to be compiled or budgets drawn up according to modern standards, the pool of competent officials was thin and easily overwhelmed. Those who did possess such skills gained influence, but also lived under pressure, caught between the expectations of European advisors and the suspicion of more traditional colleagues. In private moments, some must have felt a lonely ache, sensing that the empire was asking them to do too much with too little support, to serve as bridges between worlds that mistrusted one another. Over time, the educational lag also fed frustration among younger generations. Students at new schools, exposed to ideas of constitutionalism, nationalism, and social reform, began to compare the promises of their textbooks with the realities around them, an empire struggling with debt, corruption, and inequality. Some concluded that the problem lay not only in outdated curricula, but in the political structure that had allowed intellectual stagnation to endure. Their discontent, sharpened in dormitories and discussion circles, would help fuel movements that sought not just to reform the empire, but to remake it, or to carve new states out of its territories. By delaying broad educational renewal, the empire created both a shortage of practical expertise and a generation of partially modernized elites whose aspirations it could neither fully satisfy nor fully contain. If you imagine for a moment a small study room in late Ottoman Istanbul, a single lamp burning, shelves lined with both old manuscripts and newly printed books, you might picture a young man seated at a desk, surrounded by two worlds. On one side lie the texts his grandfather revered. On the other, treatises from Europe on physics, law, or political theory. His heart is pulled toward both, wanting to honour the past, yet also to step into a future where knowledge is wider and more dynamic. In his solitary struggle to reconcile these shelves, you can feel the Empire's larger dilemma. The deadly mistake was not in valuing tradition, but in allowing schooling to harden into a narrow gate, open too late and too cautiously to the broader sciences and skills that the age demanded. And as the empire drifted into the 20th century with this uneven intellectual awakening, another stage of its crisis was already forming, not only in classrooms and ministries, but in the very language of politics, where looming debates over constitutions, parliaments, and the limits of sultanic power would soon test whether any amount of learning, old or new, could still rescue the state from the weight of its accumulated choices. Tonight you're listening to part 10 of this journey through the Ottoman Empire's fatal mistakes, and in this part we'll move softly into the world of constitutions, parliaments and palace power to see how half-finished political reforms left the state trembling between old and new, never fully at home in either. In a quiet room in late 19th century Istanbul, you can imagine a small group of men bent over a table scattered with papers, ink pots, and ash from long, burned cigarettes, the air thick with the murmur of careful words: rights, law, representation, limits to power. Outside, the city still moves to its familiar rhythms: calls to prayer, clatter of carts, gossip in coffee houses. But in this room, another desire has taken shape, one that did not exist in quite this form in earlier centuries. These men, part of a new educated elite, long for a state that is no longer ruled solely by the shifting will of one man, however exalted, but by written rules that bind ruler and ruled alike. They dream of a constitution that would protect the empire by giving all its peoples, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Kurds, Jews and others, a shared legal framework, a parliament where grievances can be voiced and negotiated rather than exploding in revolt. In their imagination, a constitutional Ottoman Empire would be stronger, not weaker. Its subjects would feel less like distant dependents and more like citizens with a future tied to the state's destiny. Yet, even as they write and debate, a tension curls quietly inside each of them. The idea of limiting the Sultan's power carries hope, but also fear of chaos, of foreign meddling, of old foundations crumbling before new supports are in place. Across the empire, similar inner conflicts ripple through hearts that have begun to hear the new language of politics. Soldiers trained in modern academies, journalists scribbling in cramped offices, merchants reading newspapers in portside cafes. They absorb words like freedom, nation, and constitution with a mixture of excitement and unease. They want a government less arbitrary, more transparent, more accountable, yet they are also aware that the empire they live in is fragile, its borders under pressure, its finances strained, its communities distrustful of one another. In the provinces, a village notable or religious leader might hear talk of elections and parliaments and wonder whether such experiments will bring peace or simply give new tools to old rivals. Even the Sultan himself, sitting under the high domes of the palace, may feel a complicated pull, understanding that some reform is needed to placate internal discontent and ease foreign criticism, yet unwilling to let go of powers his ancestors considered their birthright. Outside the empire, this constitutional debate does not unfold in a vacuum. European powers, fresh from their own revolutions and reforms, watch the Ottoman struggles with keen, sometimes cynical interest. When the empire proclaims a constitution, foreign newspapers praise it as a step towards civilization. When it is suspended, they denounce despotism. Yet behind the words lies calculation. A more stable, constitutional Ottoman government might resist foreign demands more effectively, while a weaker, divided one would be easier to pressure. Russia, Austria, Hungary, Britain, and others each have their own preferred vision of what the Ottoman future should look like, and all are willing to encourage this or that faction when it suits their aims. The empire's internal debate over constitutions and parliaments becomes entangled with external games of influence, so that the question of who should rule and how is never only an Ottoman question. It is also a piece in the larger Eastern question puzzle that European chancelleries discuss late into their own nights. Inside the empire, there are genuine allies of a balanced constitutional order, statesmen who want neither absolute despotism nor uncontrolled upheaval. They picture a monarchy restrained by law, a parliament with real but limited powers, courts that can apply laws consistently, and a press allowed enough freedom to expose abuses without openly calling for the empire's dissolution. Some of these men will help draft the 1876 constitution, hoping it will mark the beginning of a new chapter, an Ottomanism grounded in shared rights rather than merely shared subordination. For a brief moment, when the first parliament convenes, their hopes seem almost real. Deputies from distant provinces sit in the same chamber, languages and accents mixing, petitions and proposals filling the air. Yet the experiment is fragile from the start. The empire is already under military and financial strain, and the new institutions must operate amid crises they were not mature enough to handle. When war breaks out with Russia and defeat looms, the unconstitutional framework proves easy to suspend. The Sultan, feeling surrounded by threats, chooses to close the parliament and rule more directly once again, arguing that only a firm hand can steer the ship through the storm. This decision may bring short-term coherence, but it plants a deeper seed of mistrust. Many in the educated classes conclude that the palace will always retreat from shared rule when pressure mounts, treating constitutions as temporary tools rather than binding commitments. Over the years that follow, this pattern repeats in different forms. Political exiles gather in European cities, publishing newspapers and pamphlets that criticise autocracy and call for the restoration of constitutional government. Secret societies form among officers and students, their members whispering in barracks and boarding houses about liberty and national rebirth. The Young Turk movement grows out of these networks, a mix of genuine idealism, ambition, and impatience. When the revolution of 1908 forces the restoration of the constitution and the recall of parliament, crowds pour into the streets in celebration, embracing each other across religious and ethnic lines. For a fleeting time, it seems as if the empire might finally find its political balance. But deep structural problems remain. The parties are weak and often organised along factional or ethnic lines. The bureaucracy still carries old habits. The army is restless and heavily involved in politics. Foreign powers continue to press their own agendas. Instead of a gradual, stable evolution toward constitutional monarchy, the empire experiences swings, from strong sultans suspending parliaments, to revolutionary fervour demanding rapid change, to coups and counter-coups, as different groups struggle to control the levers of the new system. For ordinary people, it can feel as if the rules are always changing, as if each new promise of lawful, representative government is followed by a setback, a dissolution, or a crisis. This constant oscillation erodes faith in the idea that politics can be a calm, predictable framework. Instead, politics begins to look like a dangerous game played by elites, dragging the country along with it. As the empire staggers into the years just before the First World War, its political landscape has become crowded and brittle. There are sultans who still hope to preserve moral authority, committees of officers who believe they must guide the nation's fate, deputies in parliament who want to legislate but find their room for manoeuvre narrow, and activists from various communities who increasingly see separate nationhood as more realistic than a reformed imperial citizenship. The deadly mistake in all this is not that the Ottomans tried to introduce constitutions and parliaments, but that they did so without forging a shared, deeply rooted agreement about the limits of power and the rules of the game, and without shielding those rules from the constant shocks of war, foreign pressure, and factional rivalry. Constitutionalism became, in practice, a tool to be seized by whichever group held the upper hand, rather than a stable structure that all accepted even when they lost. If you picture, in the softness of your own imagination, a late evening session of that Ottoman parliament, the chamber dimly lit, some benches half empty, deputies tired, papers scattered across desks, you might feel both the hope and the fragility in the room. Speeches rise and fall. Some call for unity, others for particular causes. Outside, in the dark streets, soldiers and civilians wait for news, uncertain whether this experiment can hold. The lamps flicker, shadows stretch along the walls, and somewhere beyond, the capitals glow. Armies are already marching, alliances are being signed, and new storms are forming. The empire, caught between old throne and new chamber, is about to face decisions on war and peace that will test every weakness described so far, and in the barracks and general staffs, another kind of mistake, born of misjudged alliances and overconfidence in battle, is quietly preparing to step forward and claim its place in the long, troubled story of the Ottoman decline. Tonight you're listening to part 11 of this long, quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll walk slowly into the council rooms and map-filled salons where decisions on war and alliance were made, and see how a pattern of misjudged partnerships and overconfident gambles gradually brought the empire to the edge of its final wars. If you picture a late evening in Istanbul, in the decades before the First World War, you might see a group of high officials gathered around a polished table, the lamplight pooling on maps of Europe and the Near East. Lines of railways, naval bases, and frontiers stretch across the paper like delicate veins. In these rooms lived a powerful desire to find a shield. The empire had been battered by defeats, squeezed by debts, and challenged by nationalist uprisings. Its rulers knew they could no longer face the world alone. They longed for a great ally, someone who would respect their sovereignty, modernize their army and navy, and deter the aggressive ambitions of Russia, Britain, and others. Beneath the formal language of diplomacy, the wish was almost childlike in its clarity. We are tired and surrounded. Let there be at least one strong hand that will take ours, not to break it, but to steady it. Yet even as the empire reached outward, an inner hesitation stirred. Different factions within the ruling elite saw the world through different lenses. Some older statesmen still leaned instinctively toward Britain, remembering an age when British support had helped keep Russia at bay. Others, shaped by years of frustration, British control in Egypt, suspicion over the Straits, felt that London's friendship was too conditional, too entangled with its own imperial interests. They argued instead for Germany, a rising power with no colonial claims on Ottoman territory, eager to sell arms, build railways, and offer military advisors. For younger officers, trained by German missions and impressed by Prussian discipline, Berlin seemed like the embodiment of modern efficiency. Inside many minds, a quiet conflict unfolded. Choose the ally who once protected you, but now seems patronizing and overbearing, or the newer power that promises respect, but is heading toward a collision with half of Europe. Each choice carried hope and risk. Outside the empire, the board on which these pieces moved was becoming dangerously crowded. The great powers were locking themselves into alliances and counter-alliances. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy facing off against the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. Arms races accelerated, and diplomatic crises flared like lightning along Europe's edges, from Morocco to the Balkans. Russia eyed the Straits and eastern Anatolia. Austria-Hungary fixed its gaze on the Balkans. Britain watched over India's approaches and the Suez Canal. To each of these capitals, the Ottoman Empire was not simply another state. It was a strategic prize, a corridor, a set of warm water ports and overland routes. In such a world, neutrality was theoretically possible, but practically fragile. To stand entirely alone required strength and internal cohesion the empire no longer possessed. Within the Ottoman leadership, there were still cautious voices who urged restraint. Some argued that, given the empire's exhausted finances and frail administration, the wisest course was strict neutrality in any coming European war, trading with all, aligning with none, buying time to rebuild. They looked back at the bruising Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913, when the empire had already lost most of its European territories, and felt in their bones how costly even small conflicts could be. For them, the empire's deepest need was not glory, but recovery, to rebuild the army, stabilize the currency, heal the wounds of displaced populations, and calm internal ethnic tensions. These men were allies of caution, sketching plans of gradual reform and slow strengthening, believing that any new large-scale war could only end badly for a state so strained. But alongside them stood others whose hearts beat faster at the thought of one more grand gamble. Among certain members of the Committee of Union and Progress, the group that had come to dominate politics after 1908, there grew a conviction that the empire could, with the right alliance, reverse its fortunes. They believed that a partnership with Germany would deliver modern weapons, training, and perhaps even recognition of Ottoman claims in the Arab provinces and beyond. Some thought that if the Central Powers triumphed, lost lands might be regained, humiliations avenged, and the empire's prestige restored. This mix of wounded pride and genuine strategic calculation created a potent emotional current. The memory of defeat in the Balkans made the prospect of sitting quietly on the sidelines feel, to these men, less like prudence and more like slow suffocation. As the summer of 1914 unfolded, events accelerated beyond anyone's full control. The assassination at Sarajevo set in motion alliances like falling dominoes. One by one, the great powers mobilized, their railways carrying soldiers to frontiers in a rhythm no Ottoman planner could match. In Istanbul, the leadership hesitated, then maneuvered, then hesitated again. Secret negotiations were held with both sides. Promises were weighed, suspicions nurtured. The empire signed a secret alliance with Germany even before entering the war openly, binding its fate to a power whose own path was now locked into a massive confrontation. Some officials still hoped to delay actual fighting to extract benefits from both coalitions without fully committing. But the arrival of German warships seeking refuge in the Straits and their subsequent transfer to the Ottoman Navy drew the empire step by step into the conflict. When those ships, now flying Ottoman flags but still crewed in part by Germans, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea, the path closed. War, with all its burdens, had arrived. For ordinary people across the empire, the decision did not unfold as abstract diplomacy, but as a sudden tightening of daily life. Young men were conscripted from Anatolian villages, Arab towns, Balkan refugee neighbourhoods. Families watched sons march away along dusty roads, sometimes without proper uniforms or boots. Food grew scarcer as blockades and military requisitions took effect. In distant provinces, officials struggled to maintain order with dwindling resources, even as they were ordered to collect more supplies and men for the front. The empire's already strained administrative and financial systems buckled under the demands of total war. Battlefields stretched from the Caucasus to Gallipoli, from Mesopotamia to Palestine, each front requiring troops, ammunition, and coordination that the bureaucracy, as we have seen, was ill-prepared to deliver. In the high command, difficult decisions multiplied. Some were tactical misjudgments on particular fronts, others were deeper, involving population policies driven by fear of internal betrayal as much as by military logic. Under the pressure of existential war, suspicions towards certain communities hardened into drastic and tragic measures, especially in regions where front lines and ethnic fault lines overlapped. The long, painful history of mismanaged diversity and rising nationalism now met the uncompromising logic of total war, and the results were catastrophic for countless lives. The gamble on alliance had not only exposed the empire to external defeat, it had also amplified its most dangerous internal fractures. As the years dragged on, the promise that Germany and its partners would guarantee Ottoman survival grew ever more hollow. Defeats in the Arab provinces, reverses in the Caucasus, and grinding hardship at home undercut whatever hope had existed in 1914. German support did bring some improvements in organisation and weaponry, and there were moments of unexpected resilience, Gallipoli among them, but the structural weaknesses we have been tracing could not be erased by advice and new guns alone. When the Central Powers finally collapsed in 1918, the empire found itself not in possession of regained glory, but under armistice terms that opened the way to occupation, partition plans, and the effective end of its old political form. The deadly mistake lay not only in choosing the wrong side, but in choosing to pin the empire's fate on a vast, unpredictable war at a time when its foundations were too cracked to withstand the shock. If you sit with this for a moment, you might imagine once more that smoky council room in Istanbul, now years later, after the guns have largely fallen silent. The same table is there, but the maps are different. Some regions are crossed out, others marked as zones of occupation, still others in dispute. The men who argued so fiercely for alliance and war are older now, or gone, or scattered. New faces fill the chairs, speaking of armistices, mandates, national struggles, and the possibility of something entirely new rising from the empire's ruins. On the walls, the portraits of sultans watch silently as this long story of misjudged partnerships and overconfident gambles reaches its end. And beyond the palace and ministries, in ruined towns and quiet villages, people who once called themselves subjects of a vast empire are beginning to whisper different words: homeland, republic, independence, signs that even as the old state dissolves, another kind of political imagination is slowly taking shape, waiting for its own very different chapter to begin. Tonight you're listening to part 12 of this long, quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll drift out onto the water, into harbours, shipyards and narrow straits, to see how letting sea power slip away narrowed the empire's horizons and left it exposed to forces it could no longer control. In the early centuries, the Ottomans did not think of themselves only as masters of land. In shipyards along the Golden Horn, carpenters and caulkers worked by lamplight, shaping timbers into galleys that would soon carry the crescent across the waves. Admirals like Barbarossa became legends, their fleets sweeping through the Mediterranean, challenging old maritime powers such as Venice and Spain. Standing on a headland above some captured harbour, an Ottoman sailor might have felt an immense desire to see his empire not just as a belt of fortresses stretching across 3 continents, but as a net of roots cast wide across the sea, controlling the flow of goods, pilgrims, and messages. Sea power offered something both practical and poetic: the ability to move faster than any caravan, to strike or defend with flexibility, to make the empire present in places where no soldier could march. The empire's flags flooded over key islands and ports, and its fleets were feared. The sea, if not fully mastered, felt at least like a familiar, negotiable space. But within the empire's strategic mind, a quieter imbalance began to form. The Ottomans were a land-conquering power, born from cavalry charges and frontier raids. In the inner councils where resources were allocated, armies marching across plains and mountains often felt more urgent than ships riding at anchor. An inner conflict emerged in those who understood the sea's importance. They knew that navies were expensive to build and maintain, that timber, skilled crews, and artillery all demanded steady investment. Yet they also saw the constant demands of land wars in Europe, Persia, and later Russia, each campaign crying out for more troops, more guns, more supplies. In moments of crisis, it was easier to cut funds for shipyards than for armies, easier to postpone naval reconstruction than to delay reinforcing a threatened frontier, so the empire tried to have it both ways, to remain a Mediterranean power without giving the sea the sustained attention it required. Outside the Ottoman world, other states were stepping more fully into a maritime age. Iberian kingdoms sailed around Africa and across the Atlantic, opening oceanic routes that slowly shifted the centre of global trade away from the old Mediterranean circuits the Ottomans knew so well. Later, Britain and the Netherlands built powerful navies backed by commercial fleets, intertwining military might with far-reaching trade networks. In the Mediterranean itself, Spain, Venice, and then France studied each engagement with the Ottomans, refining their tactics, ship designs, and alliances. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Christian coalition inflicted a sharp defeat on the Ottoman fleet, signalled more than just a single lost engagement. It showed that the balance at sea could be contested and overturned. Although the Ottomans rebuilt their navy afterward, the psychological tide had begun to turn. Slowly, European maritime powers learned how to combine gunnery, manoeuvre, and coalition politics to challenge and eventually overtake Ottoman influence on the water. Within the empire, there were still admirals, shipwrights, and reforming sultans who tried to push back this decline. New shipyards were founded or expanded. Foreign experts were brought in to advise on naval construction and gunnery. Individual rulers, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, poured energy into reviving the fleet. They imagined a modern navy guarding the straits, projecting power to the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean, reassuring anxious provinces that the empire's reach still extended over the waves. These people were allies of a maritime future, walking through half-finished hulls in dry docks, inspecting cannons, reviewing blueprints, but their efforts were undercut by the same forces that weakened other parts of the state: financial shortages, bureaucratic inertia, factional struggles, and the difficulty of sustaining long-term projects in a system prone to abrupt shifts in policy whenever rulers or ministers changed. At crucial moments, the cost of naval weakness revealed itself with an unforgiving clarity. In the age of sail and then steam, the empire struggled to match the pace of shipbuilding in Britain, France, or Russia. Key defeats and humiliations punctuated this story. The destruction of much of the Ottoman Egyptian fleet at Navarino in 1827, the reliance on British and French naval protection during the Crimean War, the inability to prevent foreign fleets from asserting influence, along the empire's coasts. Even when impressive warships were acquired through foreign contracts, the lack of consistent training, maintenance, and supporting infrastructure meant that the navy could not always use them to full effect. At times, political leaders, wary of coups or budget strains, allowed modern ships to sit idle, their hulls rusting slowly, while rival navies continued to train and innovate. For merchants, fishermen, and coastal communities, these high-level decisions translated into everyday vulnerabilities. A trader in Izmir or Beirut might find that foreign firms, backed by their own government's naval power, dominated key shipping routes and insurance networks. Local fleets, smaller and less protected, had to navigate not only the physical risks of the sea, but also a legal and economic environment increasingly shaped by others. In wartime, blockades and interruptions to shipping could bring hunger and hardship to cities dependent on imported grain or coal. The sea, once imagined as a highway that the empire could command, became instead a space where others could squeeze or bypass it, imposing terms on trade and diplomacy. Each lost degree of freedom on the water narrowed what was possible on land, limiting where armies could be supplied, which ports could be defended, which allies could be helped or hindered. Yet even in this story of decline, one can sense the presence of people who loved the sea and tried to keep maritime skill alive. Captains who trained crews carefully, shipwrights who took pride in workmanship despite thin budgets, coastal pilots who knew every current and shoal. Their dedication could not reverse the wider trend, but it left behind a residue of knowledge and memory, a sense that the empire had once been more at home upon the water than its later weakness might suggest. The deadly mistake was not that the Ottomans ever lost one specific battle or failed to build one particular ship, but that they never fully committed to a consistent long-term maritime strategy in an era when the sea was becoming the main theatre of global power. If you stand in imagination on the edge of the Bosphorus at dusk, watching ships move between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, you might feel this history like a faint undertow. Foreign flags glide past old Ottoman forts, modern hulls cut through waters once patrolled by galleys bearing the Sultan's standard. Along the shoreline, the remains of old shipyards and quiet arsenals hint at a time when chisels rang on timber and hammers struck iron late into the night. Now the air is calmer. The empire that tried to hold these straits as its lifeline is gone. But the straits themselves remain, a reminder that control of the sea is never granted once and for all. It must be renewed in every age. As the Ottoman state lost that grip on the water, it found itself more and more at the mercy of others' ships and schedules, treaties and blockades. And in that vulnerability, another form of dependence grew. Not only maritime or military, but also diplomatic, the long-tangled Eastern question, where foreign powers debated the empire's fate as if it were an object on a distant table, rather than a home to millions of souls whose futures hung in the balance. Tonight you're listening to part 13 of this long, quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll step softly into the salons, embassies and conference halls of Europe and Istanbul to see how the Eastern question slowly turned the empire from an actor into an object, something discussed and rearranged by others while it struggled to hold its own place at the table. In the beginning there was no question at all. The Ottomans were a rising answer, a power that took cities and reshaped borders, forcing kings and popes to adjust their maps. The empire's desire was simple but immense, to be seen as a central pillar of the world, a sovereign equal that decided its own fate. The idea that its future might one day be handled like a problem, a sick man to be managed and divided, would have felt almost absurd. Inside the empire, careful statesmen and diplomats sensed the change before the words reached the newspapers. Envoys returning from Vienna, Paris, London, and St. Petersburg brought back more than reports on tariffs or frontiers. They brought a tone, a way of speaking, in which Ottoman lands appeared as pieces on a shared board, zones of influence, protectorates, routes to India, access to warm water ports. In their hearts, these negotiators felt a quiet conflict. They were proud representatives of an old sovereignty, yet they could hear how each crisis was giving other capitals new excuses to walk deeper into the empire's affairs. They still believed that with enough skill they could balance rivals and buy time, but they also knew that every new treaty seemed to tighten, not loosen, the net. Beyond the Ottoman frontiers, the Eastern question settled into the rhythms of European diplomacy. When revolt broke out in a Balkan province, when Russia claimed to protect Orthodox Christians, when Britain feared for the road to India, foreign ministers met around map-covered tables to discuss what should be done with this or that territory. At gatherings like the Congress of Berlin, men who had never seen a remote Ottoman village drew new borders for it with calm strokes of a pen. They spoke of justice, balance of power, and civilization, but each carried private lists of ports to secure, rivals to weaken, routes to control. In that room full of strong voices, the Ottoman delegate often sounded like a single instrument trying to be heard over an impatient orchestra. The deadly mistake here was not attending these conferences. There was often no way to refuse, but drifting into a long habit of accepting that the empire's fate would always be argued in other cities, instead of insisting, with real power behind the words, that some lines could not be crossed. In Istanbul, there were always people who tried to break that habit. Some urged strict neutrality and slow, steady reform, avoid adventures, calm the provinces, make at least one or two great powers, see that a preserved, reformed empire suited them better than another messy partition. Others advocated a bolder game, align closely first with one power, then with another, to gain a patron strong enough to keep the rest at bay. These were allies of survival, working late over memoranda and draft agreements, but they were trapped by familiar limits. The leadership was divided and suspicious, the army and treasury too weak to give weight to threats or promises, and the foreign powers so locked in rivalry that almost any Ottoman move seemed threatening to someone. Strategy collapsed again and again into reaction. On the ground, this meant a pattern of half-choices. In one crisis, the empire leaned on a Western power to calm a revolt, only to pay with foreign supervision of how it treated minorities. In another, it turned toward a different patron against Russia, trading influence over railways or customs for temporary protection. With every swing, the state looked a little less like an independent player and a little more like a board on which others pushed their pieces. Local elites learned to appeal directly to consuls and embassies, sometimes using foreign interest as a shield, sometimes as a weapon. Ordinary villagers, reading scattered rumours, began to feel that their futures might be decided in faraway capitals as much as in Istanbul itself. For most people, the Eastern question did not arrive as diplomatic phrases, but as sudden changes and quiet fears. A community in the Balkans might wake to news that by treaty their district now belonged to a new kingdom. An Armenian town might hear that inspectors from Europe were coming, raising hopes of safety and also fears of backlash. On the Levantine coast, the sight of foreign warships at anchor reminded everyone that local disputes might now draw in distant empires. Each new guarantee, each foreign protector, thinned the direct relationship between subject and sovereign. The old habit of looking to the Sultan for justice gave way, bit by bit, to a new habit of looking outward, to a consulate, a foreign mission, a distant parliament, for rescue. And yet the empire still had moments of clear refusal. It sometimes blocked partition schemes, defended certain cities, or insisted that particular matters remained internal. These flashes of resolve showed that the state had not simply collapsed into passivity, but resolve without durable strength and a consistent long game could only delay, not reverse, the pattern. The more the empire survived by leaning on the patience of other powers, the easier it became for those powers to demand new concessions in return, extra privileges for their merchants, new roles in supervising reforms, indirect claims over pieces of Ottoman territory. Survival came wrapped in strings. By the early 20th century, the language in foreign capitals had cooled into something almost clinical. The empire was now drawn in zones, mandates, and spheres, like a puzzle to be divided without provoking a larger war. A few voices still argued that a reformed multi-ethnic Ottoman state might be useful, but many more saw an opportunity to extend their own reach once the old structure finally cracked. When the First World War began, and the empire chose its fatal alliance, it entered a struggle in which some of its enemies were already drafting secret plans for how to divide its lands afterward. For them, the Eastern question no longer meant how to help the Ottomans endure, but how to manage their disappearance. If you picture, very quietly, a diplomat's study in some distant capital at the end of a long day, maps of the Near East spread open, faint pencil lines marking future borders, notes in the margin about railways, oil fields, and holy cities, you can almost feel how abstract the Ottoman world had become to those faraway eyes. On their paper, mountains and rivers look simple. In reality, they are home to millions of ordinary people who do not think of themselves as a question at all, just as families, workers, and believers moving through their days. Yet, under that lamplight, their horizons are being redrawn in ink. The deadly mistake of the empire was not that others talked about it, that was almost inevitable in such a strategic place, but that over long years it could not gather enough inner strength, unity, and foresight to make its own voice final in those conversations. And when those pencil lines hardened into real frontiers after the war, the old imperial map shattered, leaving behind new states, new wounds, and in the Anatolian heartland, a new, smaller dream beginning to form, of a different kind of state, no longer an empire of many peoples, but a tighter, more guarded homeland rising from the ruins of the old. Tonight you're listening to part 14 of this quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes. And in this part we'll walk slowly through the inner maze of the palace itself, into the harem courtyards, the eunuchs' corridors, and the guarded rooms, where decisions were whispered, long before they were proclaimed, to see how power that curled inward toward the court slowly turned from a shield into a trap. In the early vigorous centuries, the palace felt like the beating heart of a confident state. Topkapi looked out over sea and city, its courtyards filled with disciplined ritual, audiences with ambassadors, councils of war, formal ceremonies that reminded everyone that the Sultan was not merely a man, but the embodiment of sovereignty. Within that world lived a deep desire to keep power close, to protect the ruler from plots, to ensure that the centre of the empire remained pure, uncorrupted by factional squabbles beyond its walls. The harem and the inner apartments were meant as sanctuaries, spaces where the dynasty could continue safely from one generation to the next. Eunuchs guarded entrances, protocol-controlled access, and layers of ceremony separated the person of the Sultan from the clamour of the streets. The intention behind all this was security. If the ruler was safe, the empire would be stable. But within the smooth surface of this ritualized world, an inner conflict slowly took root. The more carefully the Sultan was shielded, the fewer voices he heard, as succession practices shifted from warrior princes governing far-flung provinces to heirs confined in the cafes, the cage of palace seclusion. Future rulers grew up not on campaign or in provincial councils, but in rooms where every window was mediated by attendants and every conversation filtered by caretakers. A young prince might feel both privileged and intensely constrained, surrounded by luxury, yet starved of real experience, longing to prove himself, but with no real chance to govern until the moment, sudden and overwhelming, when a predecessor died. Inside him, the desire to rule well collided with the habits of isolation. How do you understand the needs of distant provinces if your world has always been measured in corridors, courtyards, and carefully staged audiences? The palace, meant to be a school of statecraft, often became instead a cocoon. Outside those guarded walls, other forces were quite content with this arrangement. Court factions, powerful grand viziers, high-ranking eunuchs, harem favourites, influential mothers of sultans, learned to navigate the palace's inner geography with ease. They developed their own networks of clients and information, deciding who could reach the ruler and whose petitions would quietly vanish. Foreign ambassadors studied these currents carefully, seeking out whichever official or palace figure seemed most receptive to their requests, sending gifts and flattery along just the right channels. In the provinces, ambitious governors and notables realized that influence in the capital did not necessarily mean convincing the Sultan directly. It meant gaining the favor of someone who stood between ruler and realm. As the empire's problems grew more complex, the path from a village grievance or a frontier crisis to the Sultan's ears became longer, more twisted, and easier to block. Yet inside the palace, there were always people who tried to use their proximity to the throne for the common good. Some Valid sultans, queen mothers, provided stability and wise counsel, acting as steadying figures when inexperienced sons took power. Certain grand viziers laboured earnestly to reform finances, reorganise the army, or negotiate better terms with foreign powers. A few enlightened sultans themselves pushed against the walls of tradition, calling for new schools, modern armies, or constitutional reforms. These men and women were allies of renewal in the very place where the empire's fate was most tightly bound, but even they had to work within a structure that rewarded intrigue as much as merit. A vizier who pushed too hard against entrenched interests could be dismissed. Or worse, a sultan who tried to bypass certain intermediaries risked provoking them into covert resistance. The palace had become a machine that could digest and soften almost any reforming impulse. This inward-curled politics had consequences far beyond Istanbul. In a distant province, a governor might hesitate to act decisively during a crisis, waiting for instructions that would take too long to arrive, because he knew that if the outcome displeased some faction at court, his career could end abruptly. A military commander facing a rebellion or foreign incursion might think not only of the battlefield, but of which palace group had the Sultan's ear, and how a setback could be spun in the capital. Over time, this bred caution where initiative was needed, flattery where honest reporting would have been more useful. The state began to move more slowly, its reactions blunted by the need to calculate not just what was right for the empire, but what would please, or at least not offend, the shifting balance of inner court politics. In moments of crisis, wars lost, uprisings spreading, foreign demands piling up, the cost of this inwardness became even clearer. Instead of a ruler and council able to weigh the full realities of the empire, decisions were sometimes made based on incomplete or distorted information filtered through the anxieties and ambitions of palace intermediaries. Bad news might be softened or delayed. Blame might be shifted to rivals rather than acknowledged as a sign of deeper structural problems. A sultan surrounded by such voices could come to distrust his own officials, seeing conspiracies everywhere, retreating further into the controlled world of trusted attendants and family. The feedback loop was cruel. The more troubled the empire became, the more the ruler hid inside the palace. The more he hid, the harder it became to grasp and address the real nature of those troubles. At the same time, the symbolic distance between ruler and ruled grew wider. In earlier ages, sultans appeared on campaign, held public audiences, or showed themselves in ways that made their presence feel tangible in the lives of their subjects. As palace-centered rule hardened, the sultan became, for many, a distant image, felt through taxes, conscription, and decrees, but rarely seen. In coffee houses and markets, people still spoke his names with respect or frustration, but he was more legend than person. That made it easier, when times grew hard, for some to transfer their emotional loyalties to nearer figures, local chiefs, nationalist leaders, or religious authorities who could look them in the eye and speak in their own dialect. The more the imperial centre focused on preserving its own inner balance, the less it could inspire the outer circles of the empire to feel that they truly belonged to a living, responsive whole. And yet if you allow yourself a quiet moment of imagination, you can stand inside one of those inner courtyards at dusk. The stone is cooling after the heat of the day. Fountains murmur, lamps flicker to life behind latticework screens. Somewhere nearby, a sultan walks in thought, perhaps aware that his empire is under pressure, perhaps only partially informed of its true condition. A few steps away, a eunuch carries messages. In another wing, the queen mother speaks with trusted advisors. In a more hidden corner, a young prince paces restlessly, wondering what kind of world he will inherit. This small, enclosed universe feels self-sufficient, almost timeless. But beyond the palace walls, railways are being laid by foreign companies, nationalist newspapers are being printed in provincial towns, foreign warships are anchoring in nearby waters. The deadly mistake is not the existence of the palace, or even of the harem. It is the way in which power allowed itself to spiral inward, wrapping itself in layers of ritual and intrigue until the empire's highest councils could no longer clearly see the lives, fears, and hopes of the millions outside. And as that inner circle talked mostly to itself, the empire missed something even more subtle, yet crucial: the chance to craft a shared story, a modern, binding sense of who we are that could speak across all those distances and identities, offering more than old symbols to hold a changing world together. Tonight you're listening to part 15 of this journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll move gently into something less visible than armies or treaties, the realm of stories, symbols, and belonging, and how failing to craft a shared modern we left the empire's peoples drifting toward other flags, other futures. In its earlier centuries, the empire carried a story that felt, to many, both clear and sufficient. It was a realm of the Sultan Caliph, a house of Islam, ruling over a protected mosaic of communities, a bridge between continents where trade and faith met under a wide imperial canopy. For a Muslim subject in Anatolia or the Balkans, the desire was often simple: to see the Sultan as both temporal ruler and guardian of the faith. For Christians and Jews, the desire was quieter but still real: to live in relative safety, keep their own rights, and accept a distant sovereign in exchange for a measure of order. The empire's identity, though unequal and hierarchical, worked because the world around it moved at a similar pace. The old language of loyalty, dynasty, religion, obedience was enough to stitch together villages, towns, and provinces into a recognizable whole. But as the 19th century unfolded, a subtle unease began to stir in many hearts. New words were entering the air: nation, fatherland, citizen, carried by students returning from Europe, by pamphlets smuggled across borders, by newspapers printed in multiple languages from Salonika to Beirut. A young Armenian intellectual in Istanbul might find his inner world populated by both ancient church traditions and fresh ideas of national awakening. A Greek merchant in the Aegean could feel pulled between the habits of Ottoman life and a growing sense of connection to an independent Greek state across the water. A Muslim student reading French or German texts might start to wonder whether Ottoman was merely an administrative label or a genuine identity. Inside each of these people, a quiet conflict formed, the inherited story of being subjects of a vast old empire on one side, and the new sharper stories of nationhood on the other, stories that promised not just protection, but pride built on language, ethnicity, and a more intimate us. Beyond the empire's frontiers, these national narratives were being sharpened into tools and banners. Newly formed states in the Balkans crafted schoolbooks, songs, and monuments that told their people that the true we was Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, Romanian, not Ottoman. Foreign powers encouraged such identitarian stories when they weakened the empire's hold, presenting themselves as champions of oppressed nationalities. Maps were redrawn with colour-coded territories, each shade standing for a different nation that, in this new logic, should ideally have its own state. The old imperial idea that many peoples could live under one crown began to sound, in European circles, like an anachronism. For those watching from abroad, the Ottoman mosaic was not a strength, but a problem to be solved, usually by breaking it into more homogeneous pieces. Inside the empire, reformers understood that something had to change in the story the state told about itself. The Tanzimat edicts and later constitutional movements were not only legal projects, they were attempts to say, we are all Ottomans now, regardless of religion. They envisioned a civic identity based on shared rights and obligations, a modern, inclusive Ottomanism that could compete with narrower nationalisms. In their speeches and writings, they tried to conjure a new we, not just Muslims ruling tolerated minorities, but a community of equal subjects bound by law and loyalty to a reformed state. These were allies of a different future, crafting phrases and principles that might have become the seed of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious citizenship. Yet their words had to travel through schools that still taught in old categories, through bureaucracies and courts that still treated people differently based on faith, and through villages where the empire was experienced less as a shared institution than as a distant tax collector and conscription officer. For many Muslims, especially Turks in Anatolia and parts of the Balkans, the new language of equality came with its own anxieties. They had long been taught that they were the core community of the empire, bearing most of the burden of military service, and in their minds, the moral weight of ruling. When reforms promised equal status to non-Muslims without convincingly sharing the burdens, some felt that their own position was being eroded, that Ottomanism might mean less privilege but not less sacrifice. In their hearts, another story began to rise, a quieter, more ethnic sense of Turkishness tied to language, homeland, and shared suffering, especially as waves of Muslim refugees from Lost Balkan and Caucasian lands poured into Anatolia with tales of dispossession. On the other side, many Christians and other minorities heard the promises of equal citizenship, but saw, in practice, continued discrimination, and occasional brutality. National movements offered them stories that spoke more directly to their experiences of marginalization, narratives in which they were not tolerated communities within an empire, but rightful heirs to their own independent states. The empire's attempt at a common narrative thus found itself squeezed between wounded pride and disappointed hope. As the 20th century approached, the gap between official story and lived reality widened. The state still spoke of unity under the Sultan and later under the Constitution, but its actions often told a harsher tale. When uprisings broke out, the response in some regions was brutal, reinforcing for minorities the story that the empire could not be reformed. When certain leaders in the Committee of Union and Progress began to emphasize a more explicitly Turkish and Muslim core to the state, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, and others heard a new message: that whatever the rhetoric of Ottoman unity, the true way of the ruling elite had narrowed. For Arab intellectuals in Damascus, Beirut, and Baghdad, this narrowing fed their own search for an Arab identity with its own language, history, and political aspirations. For Armenians, already living with deep grievances, it intensified fears that they would never be safe within a state increasingly defined in terms that did not include them as full members. There were still people who tried to hold together a broader, gentler vision. Journalists wrote in multiple languages about shared Ottoman heritage, imperial cities where cultures intertwined, common sacrifices in recent wars. Teachers in some schools attempted to cultivate respect for diversity alongside loyalty to the state. Certain politicians dreamed of a looser federal arrangement, a reimagined empire where different regions had more autonomy under a common framework. These efforts were like threads thrown across widening cracks, beautiful, sincere, and fragile. They could not fully counteract the weight of accumulated mistrust, contradictory policies, and repeated moments when the state, under pressure, chose harshness over dialogue. The world of symbols reflected this confusion. Flags flew, anthems were sung, but different communities often attached different meanings to them. In some places, imperial ceremonies still stirred genuine emotion. In others, they felt hollow, overshadowed by clandestine gatherings, where other flags were unfurled and other songs softly rehearsed. Newspapers in various languages told competing versions of the same events. A young person in Salonika or Aleppo might read one account in an Ottoman Turkish paper, another in a local Greek, Armenian, Arabic, or Ladino publication, and feel the pull of multiple belonging or the sense that they were being asked to choose. By the time the First World War erupted, these competing stories collided with the brutal logic of total conflict. Governments demanded absolute loyalty. Communities suspected one another. Long-standing fears hardened into catastrophic decisions about who belonged and who did not. The empire's failure to establish a convincing, inclusive "we" made it easier for authorities to justify drastic measures against groups framed as potential traitors, and easier for those groups in turn to imagine their future outside the imperial frame altogether. When the war ended and the old structure collapsed, the fragments of the Ottoman story scattered into new national myths: Turkish, Arab, Armenian, Greek, Kurdish, and more, each remembering the empire in its own way, sometimes with nostalgia, often with bitterness. If you sit for a moment with this, you might imagine a small cafe in a late Ottoman port city at twilight, a place where, not so long ago, men of different faiths and tongues once shared coffee and stories under the same smoky ceiling. Now, the chairs are rearranged. Some familiar faces are missing. On the wall, the old imperial emblem hangs crooked or has been taken down altogether. At one table, someone folds a new newspaper printed under a different flag. At another, an old man stares into his cup, remembering a vanished world in which, for all its injustices, there was at least a sense of living under one vast, if imperfect, roof. The deadly mistake of the empire was not that it had many peoples, but that it could not, in time, give them a shared, believable modern story in which they could all see themselves, strong enough to withstand the storms of nationalism and war. And as that common story frayed, another long neglected realm, the vast, mostly rural heart of the empire, with its weary villages and exhausted fields, was bearing the weight of all these failures, quietly absorbing the costs in hunger, displacement, and a slow grinding loss of faith in distant rulers. Tonight you're listening to part 16 of this long, quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll walk slowly away from the palaces and embassies, out along dusty roads and into the villages and fields, into the rural heart of the empire that carried the weight of all its choices, yet was too often seen only as an inexhaustible well of taxes, grain, and sons for the army. For most of its existence, the empire was not a world of marble halls and grand boulevards. It was a world of soil. In Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, the Balkans, North Africa, and Arabia, countless small villages clung to valleys, hillsides, and riverbanks. There, under broad skies and shifting seasons, lived the majority of the Sultan's subjects, farmers who rose before dawn, shouldered tools worn smooth by generations, and stepped into fields that their grandparents had worked before them. In their hearts lived a simple, sturdy desire to survive, to feed their families, to see their children grow into something slightly better than themselves. They did not ask for reforms, treaties, or high offices. They asked for rain at the right time, fair taxes, and a little protection from bandits and war. If the empire could give them that, they were prepared to accept its distant authority with a kind of resigned loyalty. Yet even in quieter centuries, an unease settled slowly into these rural lives. The land was not always generous, and the state's demands did not always match the land's moods. Some years, harvests were good, and dues could be paid. Other years, frost, flood, or locusts left granaries thin. Still, tax collectors came, sometimes insisting on amounts set on paper, far from the realities of the field. Peasants found themselves caught between the unpredictability of nature and the rigid expectations of an administration that saw them mainly as numbers in a register. Inside many souls grew a quiet conflict. On one side, the old habit of obedience, the fear of punishment. On the other, a rising sense that the burden was not shared fairly, that those who lived in cities and palaces did not truly understand what it meant to coax life from stubborn soil. Most swallowed that feeling, bent their heads, and carried on. But the seed of disillusion was there, planted deeply in the furrows of everyday hardship. Beyond these villages, the outside world was changing the meaning of agriculture itself. The age of steamships and railways tied distant markets together. Grain from the Americas and Russia flowed into Europe, altering prices and competition. Industrializing powers began to treat food as part of a global system, tied to trade policy, tariffs, and shipping routes. For the empire, still heavily dependent on traditional agriculture, this meant vulnerability. A peasant in Anatolia or the Levant might never hear the word Chicago, yet the price he received for his wheat was touched by decisions taken in foreign parliaments and trading houses. The state, struggling with its own debts and trade concessions, often responded not by shielding its rural producers, but by squeezing them harder, taxing, conscripting, requisitioning, trying to extract just a little more from a countryside already close to its limits. Inside the empire, there were men who saw the danger in this pattern. A few forward-looking officials and engineers dreamed of bringing modest irrigation projects, better roads, new seeds, and fairer tax practices to the countryside. They imagined schools in rural districts where children could learn basic literacy and practical skills without being uprooted from their land. They spoke of cadastral surveys that would clarify who owned what, reducing disputes, and giving farmers some security against arbitrary grabs. These people were allies of the peasantry, even if they seldom met them directly. They believed that a stronger empire had to grow from healthier villages, not just from new barracks and ministries. But when they carried their proposals into budget meetings and councils, they collided with the hard wall of priorities set elsewhere. Military campaigns to fund, foreign debts to service, urban projects that impressed visitors, more than unseen improvements far from the capital. For the peasants themselves, help often came not from distant reformers but from closer networks. Local notables, religious leaders, tribal chiefs, who could sometimes negotiate with tax officials or provide a bit of grain in lean years. Yet those same figures could also be exploiters, interposing themselves between village and state, taking a cut of everything that moved along the chain. In many places, land ownership patterns grew more skewed over time, with large estates expanding as indebted smallholders lost their plots. A family that had once tilled its own fields now worked as tenants or sharecroppers, handing over a significant portion of the harvest each year to landlords and collectors. The empire, needing revenue, often sided with whoever could guarantee payments, even if it meant reinforcing inequalities that drained the countryside of hope. As the 19th and early 20th centuries unfolded, rural life bore the brunt of every crisis. When wars broke out, the army needed men and supplies, and it was the villages that sent their sons and carts. When refugees arrived from lost Balkan provinces from the Caucasus, they were often settled among already struggling rural communities, adding mouths to feed and tensions to manage. When disease or famine struck, the response from the centre was uneven. Some regions received aid and attention, others waited for help that never came, relying instead on the thin resilience of mutual aid among neighbours. In the minds of many villagers, the empire's presence came to be associated less with steady protection and more with sudden demands, a new levy, a new call-up, a new requisitioning of animals and grain. Under such conditions, loyalty to the state gradually thinned, even where open rebellion never erupted. A young man watching his father haggle with tax collectors, or seeing his brothers marched away year after year to distant fronts, might begin to feel that the empire he was told to honour gave little back in return. In some regions, this resentment fed into emerging national or local identities. In others, it hardened into a more general distrust of authority. The countryside, instead of being the empire's quiet reservoir of strength, became a landscape of fatigued obedience, a population that would not necessarily rise in defence of a state that had, in their experience, so rarely risen in defence of them. Yet, even amid this exhaustion, you can imagine isolated moments of grace. A conscientious district officer rides out to inspect villages personally, overrides a harsh collector, arranges for some food to be distributed in a bad year. A village teacher, paid poorly and living simply, keeps a small class going under a tree or in a bare room, giving a handful of children their first letters and numbers. A doctor, trained in a distant city, travels along muddy roads to treat patients in hamlets that have rarely seen such care. These lives did not reverse the broader decline, but they left traces, memories of individuals who, even as the empire faltered, tried to embody a different kind of relationship between centre and periphery. By the time the First World War engulfed the empire, the rural heartland was already strained to breaking. Mass conscription pulled away labour, blockades and requisitions emptied storerooms. In some regions, especially where fronts and famines coincided, entire communities were pushed to the edge of survival. When the war ended and new political movements rose in Anatolia and parts of the Arab world, they drew deeply on the stamina of these same villages, asking once more for sacrifices, this time in the name of narrower homelands and new flags. The empire, which had long treated the countryside as a resource to be spent rather than a partner to be nourished, had little moral capital left to call upon. Its inability to systematically improve rural life through infrastructure, education, fair taxation, and protection was a deadly mistake, not because it instantly toppled thrones, but because it eroded, year by year, the silent consent on which any large state depends. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might see a single village at dusk somewhere in the old Ottoman lands, a few low houses clustered around a well, smoke rising from cooking fires, a dog barking in the distance. The fields beyond are stubbled after harvest. The soil is tired, and so are the people. They have lived under many decrees, heard of many sultans, watched rumours of reform come and go like passing clouds. Tomorrow they will rise and work again, because the earth leaves them no other choice. Far away, in cities and capitals, men argue over maps and principles, over constitutions and alliances. Out here, the questions are simpler and harsher, and it is precisely because so many of those distant arguments were never translated into steady, tangible improvements in places like this that, in the end, the empire's rulers found themselves relying on last-minute decrees, emergency committees, and desperate improvisations. One more pattern of short-term fixes that could not repair the long, slow damage already done. Tonight you're listening to part 17 of this quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll move gently among people rather than borders or ministries. We'll follow refugees on the road, emptied neighbourhoods and forced marches, to see how the empire's violent reshaping of its own population tore at the very fabric it was trying to save. In almost every age of the empire, people were on the move. Soldiers marching to new frontiers, traders sailing between ports, pilgrims crossing mountains and deserts toward holy cities. For centuries, these movements felt like part of a living rhythm. But in the 19th and early 20th centuries, another, harsher kind of movement grew. Waves of Muslim refugees fleeing from lost lands in the Balkans, the Caucasus and Crimea. Christian and other minority communities pushed from homes they had occupied for generations. Whole districts emptied not by choice but by decree and fear. Behind many of these movements lay a deep desire shared by those in power and those on the road, the desire to feel safe in a shrinking, threatening world. Leaders in Istanbul longed for reliable populations along vulnerable frontiers. Refugees longed for any place where they would not be hunted or humiliated. Families of every background longed simply to live without waiting for the knock at the door that would mean it was their turn to go. Inside the empire's rulers and officers, an inner struggle unfolded as the map contracted and anxieties grew. On one side was an older pragmatic instinct, the knowledge that the empire had once lived with diversity, that different peoples could share towns and trade routes under a single crown. On the other side was a rising current of fear and anger, sharpened by nationalist revolts and foreign interventions. After each lost province in the Balkans, more Muslim refugees arrived in Anatolia, telling stories of atrocities and flight. After each uprising, some officials concluded that mixed regions were nothing but traps waiting to be sprung. The question whispered through councils and barracks was cruelly simple. If the world is dividing into sharper national spaces, is there still room for a multi-ethnic empire, or must we harden our own core, even at terrible human cost? Beyond the empire's borders, other forces made this question more brutal. European states championed different subject peoples when it suited them, loudly condemning some massacres while staying remarkably quiet about others. New national governments in the Balkans engaged in their own forms of population pressure, driving out communities seen as alien to their national story. International law and institutions that might have restrained ethnic cleansing were weak or non-existent. In such a world, Ottoman leaders saw not only what they did, but what others were doing as well, and some persuaded themselves that harsh measures were merely a grim adaptation to the times. If we do not secure our heartland, they told themselves, we will be pushed into the sea. External wars and interventions thus did not simply damage the empire from outside, they also fed the inner logic that made population engineering seem thinkable, even necessary to frightened men in power. Inside this dark landscape, there were still people who tried to pull in another direction. Individual officials refused to carry out extreme orders, local religious figures sheltered neighbours of another faith, diplomats argued for restraint, and some journalists and intellectuals warned that a state built on the suffering of its own inhabitants would never find peace. These were fragile allies of a more humane vision, scattered across provinces and offices. A village imam preaching that cruelty toward one's neighbour was a betrayal of true belief, an Armenian or Greek priest urging his flock to see ordinary Muslims not as faceless enemies, but as fellow sufferers in a brutal age. A district governor quietly slowing or softening instructions from above, all left small, luminous traces in the record, but they were swimming against a flood of fear, propaganda, and orders backed by soldiers and guns. The turning points came not in a single edict, but in a series of decisions, each one pushing the state further along a path of forced displacement and violence. Policies that once aimed to move troublesome tribes or resettle refugees became templates for something colder, the large-scale removal of entire communities from strategic regions. In some places, this meant coerced migration under terrible conditions. In others, it meant massacres that left villages silent forever. The First World War, with its atmosphere of siege and suspicion, intensified this logic to a catastrophic degree. Worried about internal rebellion near front lines, some leaders answered, not with careful policing and political compromise, but with sweeping deadly measures against whole populations. What they saw as security or necessity looked, and still looks, to those who suffered it like the deliberate destruction of their worlds. For ordinary people, these decisions were not phrases in a dispatch, but the dust of the road under bare feet, the sound of doors closing behind them, the smell of smoke from their own burning houses. A Muslim family from the Balkans trudging into Anatolia, having seen their old home turned into someone else's nation, an Armenian family driven from its town along tortuous routes eastward, a Greek community watching ships carry them away from a coastline their ancestors had known for centuries. An Arab village caught in the crosswinds of wartime orders and reprisals. Each carried its own story of loss. The countryside and city quarters that had once held overlapping communities thinned and hardened, where there had been shared markets and mixed neighbourhoods, new lines of memory and resentment formed. Even when some form of normalcy returned, the absences were everywhere. Empty houses, abandoned churches and mosques, unmarked graves along forgotten tracks. The deadly nature of this mistake lay not only in the immediate suffering it caused, but in the long shadows it cast. By trying to create security through coercive homogeneity, the late empire and its successors inherited landscapes marked by grief, anger, and competing memories of victimhood. The subtle arts of coexistence, everyday habits of sharing space, work, and festivals were shattered in many places, replaced by quieter, more guarded relations, or by complete separation. The old imperial idea that many peoples could live under one political roof was not simply overtaken by abstract theories of nationalism, it was drowned in very real blood and tears. And for the empire itself, these policies did not bring the stability their authors imagined. They further isolated the state diplomatically, deepened internal moral fractures, and convinced many remaining subjects that this was no longer a house in which their children could safely dream. If you pause and imagine very softly a deserted street in a once mixed town at twilight, the shop signs in different scripts fading, a locked door with a rusting knocker, weeds in a courtyard where children once played, you can almost feel the echo of voices that are no longer there. Somewhere, a family in another country remembers this street only as a story told by grandparents. Somewhere else, another family walks past, aware that their home once belonged to people who left under a dark cloud, unsure how to hold that knowledge. The empire that presided over such transformations thought, in its fear, that it was saving itself by reshaping who lived where. In truth, it was cutting through its own deepest roots. And as the dust settled over these altered landscapes, the state that had ordered so many movements and removals found itself moving too, toward its own end, and toward a much smaller, harsher idea of what kind of political community could still be built from the fragments left behind. Tonight you're listening to part 18 of this long, quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, and in this part we'll walk slowly into the hills and valleys of the Balkans to see how misreading this restless frontier, its fears, its hopes, its rising national dreams, turned a long, painful region of tension into the place where the empire's European soul finally slipped away. For centuries, the Balkans were not simply a problem on a map. They were one of the empire's living hearts. In small towns under red-tiled roofs, in orthodox monasteries and village mosques, in market squares where Slavic, Greek, Albanian, Turkish, Vlach, Roma and Jewish voices mingled, a dense web of everyday life tied people to each other and, in its own way, to Istanbul. An Ottoman official travelling through these lands in the 17th century might have seen busy caravan routes, prosperous estates and garrison towns that supplied the empire with grain, timber and soldiers. Inside him, and inside the rulers he served, lived a strong desire to keep this region quiet and loyal, a solid bridgehead into Europe, rather than a crack in the imperial wall. Yet beneath that surface, even in earlier times, there were currents of difference, religious, linguistic, local, that could either be woven into a durable fabric or, if mishandled, pulled apart into dangerous threads. As the centuries passed and the empire's energy waned, it increasingly chose the second path, not always through conscious malice, but through a series of misjudgments that treated the Balkans as something to be controlled and squeezed, rather than carefully listened to and slowly reimagined. When the age of nationalism reached this region in the 19th century, those earlier choices came due. Inside many Balkan communities, an inner tension began to grow long before the first independence proclamations were read. A village Orthodox priest or teacher might still pray for the Sultan's health and accept his authority, yet he also heard new songs and stories coming from across borders about Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, not as old provinces or tribes, but as awakened nations. Young men who studied in foreign schools or in the new national seminaries returned with books and pamphlets that spoke of language as destiny, of peoplehood as something that should have its own state, not merely a tolerated space within an empire. In their hearts, they felt a quiet conflict. The empire was the world they knew, the framework within which their parents had lived. But these new ideas promised something more intimate, more theirs, a fatherland that spoke in their own tongue and prayed in their own way. At first, many hoped that reforms in Istanbul might make it possible to be both, loyal Ottomans and proud Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, Albanians. But the gap between the promises on paper and the realities in villages and towns grew too wide. Tax burdens remained heavy, conscription calls felt arbitrary, local abuses by officials and bandits alike went uncorrected. Each broken promise nudged more hearts toward the conclusion that coexistence under the old structure was a fading dream. In Istanbul, there were statesmen who sensed the danger and tried to adjust. Some of the Tanzimat reformers believed that giving Christians greater legal equality, improving provincial administration, and curbing the worst abuses could tame the nationalist tide. They issued firmans, reorganised provinces, created mixed councils, and tried to show Europe that the empire could be just to all its subjects. These men were allies of a multi-ethnic future, labouring late in ministries over new provincial laws and debating how to bring better schooling and courts to troubled districts. Yet they faced pressure from every side. Conservative Muslim elements feared that Christian equality meant Muslim humiliation. European powers demanded protections for their co-religionists but were never satisfied, always ready to use any local disturbance as a reason to intervene. National activists in the Balkans, having tasted the language of sovereignty, often regarded imperial reforms as too little, too late, mere tactics to delay the independence they now saw as inevitable. Caught between these forces, many well-intentioned initiatives remained thin on the ground, like light rain evaporating before it could soak into dry soil. On that soil, sharper conflicts sprouted. Local uprisings, sometimes born of specific abuses, increasingly clothed themselves in the banners and songs of national liberation. A tax revolt in one valley became part of a Serbian or Bulgarian struggle. An argument over church appointments turned into a contest over which patriarchate, Greek or national, would define people's identity. The empire's responses often mixed firmness with clumsiness. Troops were sent, villages were punished, conspirators were chased, but the deeper grievances were rarely addressed in ways that changed minds. Scenes of violence, whether the burning of villages by imperial forces or attacks on Muslims by insurgent bands, travelled quickly in rumour and printed word. For Muslims, especially Turks and Albanians who had lived in the Balkans for generations, each uprising fed the fear that they were being surrounded and squeezed out of lands they considered home. For Christians, each suppression confirmed that the empire was, at its core, unreformable. Two wounded narratives hardened side by side, both increasingly certain that the other could not be trusted. Beyond the mountains, foreign chancelleries fanned these embers when it suited them. Russia presented itself as the protector of Slavs and Orthodox Christians. Austria-Hungary manoeuvred to block Slavic unification while extending its own influence. Britain and France shifted between backing reforms and worrying about the balance of power. Each major crisis, the Greek War of Independence, the uprisings of the 1870s, the Russo-Turkish War, the carving up of territories at the Congress of Berlin, left the empire weaker and the Balkan map more fractured. In each round, the Ottomans lost land, population and prestige, while the great powers gained new leverage. The deadly mistake was not only in losing battles, it was in consistently entering negotiations from a position of reactive weakness, accepting arrangements that satisfied no one fully, and that left Muslims and Christians in the remaining Ottoman Balkans with fresh grievances and fewer reasons to believe that peaceful coexistence under Istanbul's rule was still possible. For the ordinary people of the region, these decades felt less like a neat story of awakening nations and more like an unending series of disruptions. A Muslim family in a small town might find itself suddenly on the wrong side of a new border, its status changed overnight from imperial subjects to unwelcome minority. Christian villages might rejoice at nominal independence, only to discover that new national elites could be just as demanding as the old regime, and that Ottoman reprisals and bandit raids did not vanish with the change of flags. Refugee columns, Muslim and Christian, trudged in opposite directions along muddy roads, each carrying what little they could salvage of their lives, each convinced that they were the ones driven out by injustice. The empire, instead of acting as a careful guardian over these fragile communities, was often experienced as either a heavy hand or a retreating shadow, present mostly in the form of soldiers and taxes, absent when protection or fair mediation were needed most. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 crystallized all of these accumulated failures into a brutal, concentrated disaster. An alliance of Balkan states struck at the remaining Ottoman territories in Europe, and within a short span, the empire lost almost all of its Balkan lands. Muslim populations fled in huge numbers toward Anatolia, adding to the already strained capacities of the state to feed and resettle them. Towns and villages changed hands, sometimes more than once. Atrocities occurred on all sides. The sense of an old shared world collapsing under the weight of competing national dreams became inescapable. In Istanbul, leaders watched a region that had supplied so many soldiers, officials, and cultural influences slip away, leaving behind a narrower, more anxious sense of what the empire now was. The vision of a multi-continental state gave way to a defensive crouch around Anatolia and a few remaining provinces. The Balkans, mishandled for generations, had finally broken loose. What remained was not a healed core, but a wounded one. If you stand in imagination on a quiet ridge somewhere in the Balkans at sunset and let your mind drift back over those years, you might see the ghosts of many flags fluttering in the same wind. The old green banners of the sultans, the crosses and tricolours of new national armies, standards carried by irregular bands who came and went with the seasons of war. Below, in a valley, a village's church and mosque stand not far apart. Their stones weathered, their congregations changed again and again by departures and arrivals. Some families speak of Istanbul as a distant memory. Others remember a time when their grandfathers were Ottoman soldiers. Others still talk only of the nation-state they now belong to, its story written over everything that came before. The empire's deadly mistake in the Balkans was not simply losing territory, it was failing over many decades to nurture a political and emotional order that could transform an old imperial mosaic into a new, shared belonging before sharper, narrower identities pulled that mosaic apart. And as the empire stumbled away from its European lands, more crowded with refugees, more haunted by loss, it carried those unhealed wounds with it into its final years, where they would shape how it remembered itself, and how the new states rising from its ruins would remember it in turn as either oppressor or lost home, villain or vanished frame, in the quiet, contested theatre of memory that still stretches long after empires are gone. Tonight you're listening to part 19 of this journey into the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes, And in this part, we'll move gently out of battles and decrees and into something softer but very powerful, the stories told about the empire by its enemies, by its own elites, and later by historians, and how misunderstanding its own condition became one more quiet thread in the fabric of its fall. For most of its long life, the empire did not sit around calling itself declining. In the 16th and even 17th centuries, its rulers and subjects saw a world still full of possibility, new campaigns, new mosques rising against the sky, caravans moving under the protection of the Sultan's name. Inside that world lived a steady desire to believe that the order they knew was fundamentally sound, that any trouble was a passing storm, not a change of climate. When tax receipts dipped, when rebellions flared, when a war went badly, many officials preferred to see these as local, temporary failures, not signs that the basic way of governing, taxing and fighting might need deep rethinking. It is comforting, after all, to treat cracks in the wall as flaws in the plaster rather than in the foundations. That comfort became, over time, a subtle but deadly habit. Within the minds of thoughtful men across the empire, a quiet conflict emerged. On one side, they could see with their own eyes the signs of strain, unpaid soldiers rioting, provincial notables acting like mini-princes, foreign goods flooding markets, new ideas among students. On the other, they carried a lifetime of teachings affirming the perfection or near perfection of the imperial order, buttressed by religious and legal traditions that framed change as something dangerous. A judge or scholar might read a report about a failing province and think, this is serious, and yet, a heartbeat later, reassure himself that the old remedies, new officials, a stern decree, a pious reform would suffice. To admit that deeper structural change was necessary felt almost like doubting the wisdom of ancestors and the justice of God. Holding those two thoughts at once, recognition of crisis and loyalty to inherited forms, was exhausting. Many simply leaned harder on familiar explanations: moral decay, the sins of individuals, the wrath of heaven, anything but the need to redesign the machinery itself. Outside the empire, another story was taking shape, one that would slowly harden into a cliché. The sick man of Europe. Foreign observers, some perceptive, some careless, described the Ottomans as decaying, stagnant, hopelessly backward. For their own strategic purposes, European statesmen sometimes found it useful to exaggerate Ottoman weakness, to portray intervention as a form of necessary management. In salons and newspapers, the empire became a symbol more than a reality, a convenient example of what happened when a supposedly oriental system failed to keep pace with modernity. This narrative, repeated often enough, began to seep inward. Ottoman intellectuals read foreign accounts, students in Europe heard their homeland discussed in tones of pity or contempt. In their hearts, they wrestled with a painful question: were these outside voices entirely wrong, or was there a grain of truth that their own elders were refusing to face? Within the empire itself, different groups clung to different stories as armour. Conservative circles insisted that the main problem was moral decline. If only rulers and subjects returned to stricter piety and obedience, the old strength would reappear. Reformists argued that what was needed was more Western-style institutions and technologies, often underestimating how deeply social habits and power structures would resist such grafts. Nationalists of various stripes began to say that the empire was not their true home at all, that the only path forward lay in breaking away to form a state wrapped in a narrower identity. Each of these stories contained fragments of truth, but each, when held alone and defended like a fortress, became a way of not listening fully to reality. The deadly mistake here was not in having narratives, but in letting them become so rigid that counter-evidence bounced off them instead of leading to adjustment. Even among later historians, the empire's fate became a subject of debate that sometimes obscured as much as it revealed. Some painted the Ottomans as doomed by essence, too Islamic, too Eastern, too despotic to ever modernize. A sweeping dismissal that ignored centuries of adaptation, complexity, and genuine creativity. Others swung in the opposite direction, arguing that there was no real decline at all, only transformation, as if the very real suffering of people caught in wars, famines, and expulsions could be folded neatly into a neutral word. In between these poles, more careful scholars tried to trace a subtler path, an empire neither uniquely doomed nor simply normal, but one that made specific choices under specific pressures and paid for them over time. Yet these more nuanced views were often harder to carry into public memory, which prefers clean morals and simple villains. For the people who actually lived through the late Ottoman era, the clash of interpretations was not abstract. A young officer might read a pamphlet insisting that the empire was still strong if only treacherous elements were purged, and feel stirred to harshness. Another might read European critiques and conclude that nothing short of tearing down the old order would suffice. A minority intellectual, long frustrated by discrimination, might embrace national narratives that painted the empire as an unbroken chain of oppression, forgetting the more complicated textures of earlier centuries. A peasant, hearing bits of all these stories second-hand, might find only one thing certain. However the historians and politicians argued, the burdens on his back and the dangers to his children's future were very real. Inside the high councils, misreading the empire's condition had immediate consequences. Leaders who believed that the state was on the verge of rebirth, if only one dramatic gesture were made, a bold alliance, a sweeping purge, a sudden centralization, were more prone to gamble recklessly. Those who thought that all talk of decline was foreign slander could delay necessary but painful reforms in the name of pride. Others, consumed by fatalism, saw every crisis as proof that nothing could be done, surrendering to passivity when action, however difficult, was still possible. Between overconfidence, denial, and despair, the space for clear-eyed, patient, and honest appraisal was small, and those who inhabited it rarely held power for long. And yet, even here, small pockets of clarity existed. Some Ottoman thinkers, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, wrote with a remarkable mixture of love and criticism. They acknowledged corruption, injustice, and strategic blunders, but also insisted that these were not the whole story, that the empire still held resources of talent, memory, and moral vision. They argued that true loyalty meant telling hard truths, not flattering the state with fantasies of unbroken greatness or dismissing it as irredeemable. In salons, newspapers, and cramped study rooms, they tried to craft a narrative in which the empire's peoples could face their past honestly and still imagine a transformed future together. Their voices were often drowned out by louder, simpler slogans, but their writings remain as a reminder that another kind of self-understanding was possible. If you sit quietly with all this, you might imagine an old scholar in Istanbul at the very end of the empire's life, sitting by a window that looks out over the Bosphorus. On the table before him lie manuscripts from earlier centuries, chronicles of victories, legal opinions, theological treatises, and beside them, newspapers full of words like nation, mandate, republic, partition. He runs his fingers over the pages and feels both pride and sorrow. His inner voice asks, was it all decline from some golden age onward, or a series of choices, some wise, many not, in a world that changed faster than anyone could fully grasp? He knows that later generations will argue over these questions, perhaps using his homeland as a symbol in debates that have little to do with the lives he remembers. As the light fades, he closes his eyes and feels that the Empire's final mistake, in a way, was not only what it did or failed to do, but what it could not bring itself to see clearly about itself, its strengths, its wounds, its limits. For without that clarity, even the best intentioned efforts flailed in half-darkness, and from that half-darkness, another kind of story is already forming, one that will step out of the imperial frame altogether, the story of a new, smaller state rising from the ruins, choosing which pieces of the Ottoman past to carry forward, which to bury, and which to quietly forget. Tonight you're listening to part 20, the final step in this long, quiet journey through the Ottoman Empire's deadly mistakes. And in this closing chapter, we'll drift gently into the last years of the Empire's life to watch how all the failures we've traced, military, economic, political, and emotional, quietly converged into a single, irreversible outcome. This is not a tale of a dramatic collapse in one night, but of a slow unweaving where threads slipped loose one by one until the old fabric could no longer hold together. By the end of the First World War, the Empire was tired in a way that went beyond battle losses. Its people were hungry, its treasury was exhausted, its provinces were broken by conflict, its administrators were running on hope more than authority. Inside the hearts of those who still sat in government offices or walked through the palace courtyards, there remained a stubborn desire to salvage something, anything, of the old order. A minister drafting reports late at night might whisper to himself that the Empire had survived earlier disasters and risen again. Perhaps it could do so one more time. A soldier returning from the front with worn boots and hollow eyes might still salute the memory of the Sultan, hoping that the misery had meaning. Even ordinary families burying their dead and nursing their wounded clung to the hope that peace might allow some familiar world to return. That desire to believe that the Empire could still be itself was gentle, human, and heartbreaking. Yet deep inside many minds, another truth stirred, one difficult to face. Every effort to imagine renewal ran into the walls erected by earlier mistakes, the broken finances, the fraying administrative systems, the deep mistrust among different communities, the dependence on foreign powers that now acted as arbiters of the Empire's fate. Officials who tried to raise new armies knew that vast regions no longer trusted Istanbul. Statesmen who negotiated with European envoys could sense that the great powers saw the Empire not as a partner, but as a problem to be disposed of. Intellectuals who dreamed of constitutional revival knew that the population was too exhausted, too scattered, too wounded for quick political miracles. Inside each of them, a quiet conflict grew. To keep believing in the Empire felt loyal, even sacred, but to accept reality felt necessary. How do you mourn something while still living inside it? Beyond the Empire's borders, decisions were being made that would shape its final form, or its disappearance. The Allied powers, victorious and confident, spoke of mandates, protectorates, and self-determination, but their maps revealed other priorities: controlling trade routes, securing oil, managing rivalries among themselves. Just as in earlier decades of the Eastern Question, the Empire's fate was being discussed in distant rooms by men who saw its lands as strategic assets rather than living homes. In Paris and London, diplomats argued over the shape of a post-Ottoman Middle East with little understanding of the local histories, loyalties, or grievances. They believed they were crafting stability. In truth, they were planting new seeds of conflict whose roots would stretch far beyond their own lifetimes. Whether they intended harm or good, the effect was the same. The empire's last chance to negotiate its future as a sovereign actor slipped quietly away. Inside the Ottoman elite, a handful of people still tried to chart another path. Some hoped that by accepting certain terms of the armistice and cooperating with the Allies, the empire could preserve a shrunken but sovereign core around Istanbul and western Anatolia. Others dreamed that a reformed constitutional system might still unify Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, and others into a loose federation under a renewed Ottoman identity. These were the final allies of a gentler ending, envisioning a transformation rather than a dissolution. But the realities they faced were harsh. Dissatisfaction among the empire's remaining subjects, the rise of rival nationalisms, foreign occupation of key cities, and a worn-out infrastructure unable to enforce any consistent policy. The plane on which they were trying to draw a new map had already cracked beneath them. The countryside, meanwhile, bore the marks of cumulative crisis. Fields lay untilled because so many men had died or been conscripted. Roads were broken, bridges damaged, railways sabotaged. Refugees crowded into towns and villages, carrying grief and resentment in equal measure. In some regions, local militias and community leaders stepped into the vacuum left by a fading state. People looked for anyone who could offer order, even at the cost of old loyalties. This decentralization had happened before, in smaller waves across the empire's history, but now it was nearly total. The old imperial frame no longer fit the realities beneath it. Among the empire's educated youth, especially those who had been shaped by new schools and foreign texts, a different idea took root. Perhaps the empire should not be saved at all. Perhaps something new should be built from its core. For Turkish-speaking Muslims in Anatolia, who had absorbed both humiliation and hardship in recent decades, the notion of a smaller, ethnically rooted homeland began to feel more realistic than a multi-ethnic empire stretched thin across continents. For Arab intellectuals, the same war had awakened the beliefs that they had the right to chart their own course, free from Istanbul's oversight. Armenians, Greeks, Kurds, each had their own wounded visions shaped by loss and longing, some dreaming of independence, some of autonomy, some simply of safety. The old imperial identity had fractured into a dozen competing futures. This competition was not merely ideological, it was emotional. A Turkish peasant who had welcomed waves of refugees into his village might see the empire's collapse through the lens of trauma and survival. A Greek or Armenian merchant whose community had suffered violence and displacement would remember the empire as something oppressive, something to flee or replace. An Arab teacher in Damascus or Baghdad might look at the empire's final years and see neglect and broken promises. In each memory, a different story formed, and these stories, far more than treaties, shaped the new borders of the post-Ottoman world. There were still individuals who tried to hold onto an older vision of coexistence. Muslim and Christian neighbours who quietly protected each other when violence threatened, Jewish families who acted as intermediaries. Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, and Arab intellectuals who wrote about shared histories even as others tore them apart. Their voices were soft, overshadowed by louder calls for separation and revenge. But they remind us that even in the empire's final hours, there remained fragments of a world where difference had not yet hardened into permanent division. If the empire had been able, earlier in its life, to nourish such voices rather than marginalize them, perhaps its story would have ended differently. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was the moment when the empire's dissolution became official on paper, a carving up of lands into zones of influence and mandates, but the true end came not with a signature, but with a collective slipping away of belief. Long before the treaty, people had stopped looking to Istanbul for solutions. Communities turned inward or outward, but rarely upward to the old imperial centre. Authority dissolved, not in a single blow, but like salt in water. And yet, even as the empire dissolved, something new was stirring in its ashes. In Anatolia, a resistance movement began to coalesce, led by men who understood that the empire, as it had been, could not be revived, but that something else might still be built, a republic anchored not in dynastic tradition, but in collective survival. This movement carried both the legacy of Ottoman failures and the raw determination born of Ottoman endurance. The empire died, but the memories, institutions, and cultural threads it had woven did not vanish. They flowed into the new state and into others formed around its former provinces. If you sit quietly with all of this, you might imagine a final scene. The sun setting over the Bosphorus, the great domes and minarets of Istanbul catching the last orange light. The empire is ending, not with trumpets, not with a roar, but with a long exhale. In the streets below, life goes on. Fishermen pulling in nets, mothers comforting children, an old man sweeping the steps of a mosque, refusing to let dust claim what remains. Empires fall, but people continue. They rebuild, reimagine, reshape. And so this long journey ends not with condemnation, but with understanding. The Ottoman Empire did not perish because it was uniquely flawed. It fell because, like all vast human constructions, it carried within it both wisdom and blindness, resilience and fragility. Its mistakes were many, but so were its achievements. Its end was tragic, but its legacy lives on. In languages, foods, architectures, memories, and the quiet human habits formed over centuries of shared life. Thank you for walking through this long night of history. May these stories settle softly, like old dust on stone, and remind you that behind every rise and fall lies a tapestry of choices, dreams, fears, and hopes, woven by countless hands, each believing they were doing their best in the fading light.